Useless loser becomes a skeleton but starts evolving into a high-rank monster. Rentt is an ugly, pathetic, disgusting loser adventurer from a small town who dreams about becoming a Mythril-class adventurer. Yet, despite working for 10 years, Rentt has been a dumb bronze-class adventurer for eternity. He usually wakes up early just like me and all poor people who need to work. Yet, despite having a dream job, all he can do are basic missions. This is because the Adventurer Guild puts ranks on their missions to avoid unnecessary deaths. While checking the current missions, Rentt realizes they're all pretty much trash. Therefore, he decides to explore the labyrinth. However, despite the labyrinth being deserted because everyone already cleared it, Rentt is surprised when he sees a secret passageway. He gets hyped, thinking he can report this discovery to the guild and become rich. However, this pathetic excuse of a human decides to explore it, hoping to find treasures. He manages to enter a room where he sees a huge dragon. He thinks this is the greatest type of monster, and according to the legends they have several forms, and this one follows the Rock's workout program. The dragon starts to approach him, and Rentt cannot move, otherwise he will wet himself. In the end, this huge dragon with 2 mouths takes a huge bite on his breakfast. However, hours later Rentt manages to get up, surprised to be alive. However, when he looks at his reflection, he notices that he has become an uglier skeleton. After the shock, he wonders if he's truly alive until he realizes that he has become an undead monster. He thinks about returning to the town because he still has his human memories. However, if a bishop or a priest finds him, they will destroy him with their magic. He realizes the dragon is missing and decides to get out of the room to avoid a potential double kill. As he walks, Rentt explains that nobody knows where the labyrinths come from or how they work. They only know there are many around the world with treasures inside. Rentt thinks about waiting for a new adventurer to come to this labyrinth and ask for help. However, he's just a pile of bones who cannot talk. Suddenly, another skeleton appears and confronts Rentt. Rentt wants to defeat it with his sword, but recognizes that it's hard to move his body without any muscles. He raises his sword to strike this skeleton, but he ends up falling behind. Yet, the other skeleton also suffers from calcium deficit as it trips after losing its leg bone. Rentt realizes that it's going to be hard to deal with a monster without sword techniques or muscles. He then suddenly finds out that he can still use spirit energy to buff up his physical attributes despite not being human. With this buff, he manages to destroy the skull and sees the bone pile glow with some pixie powder. He finds out that he just recovered the spirit energy he used and remembers his talk with his friend Lorraine. She is a researcher who told him that monsters could evolve into other species. At that time, she mentioned that skeletons could sometimes evolve into ghouls, calling it existential evolution. After this memory, Rentt thinks that if he can evolve into a ghoul, he can get some flesh back. He then could use some clothes to cover himself and return to the town without any problems. Therefore, Rentt decides to start defeating monsters in this labyrinth for a chance to evolve. He quickly manages to defeat 5 skeletons and manages to get some of his mobility back. Every time he defeats an enemy, he gets healed, and that allows him to use his spirit energy in every battle. While looking for more monsters, he finds a slime. Despite being a weak monster, there are only 2 ways to defeat it: to pierce its core or beat it up until it cannot regenerate. Rentt manages to dodge the slime's attack and counters. However, he didn't expect to hit the core on his first try. He decides to keep the magic stone and collects the slime fluid to sell it later on, as it's used in cosmetics. Over time, Rentt notices that as an undead, he doesn't need to sleep or eat, which helps him to focus on fighting to achieve his evolution. However, that seems to be taking a long time. Still, he managed to get his physical abilities back and could use mana and divine power again despite being undead. Yet he feels down because he spent 10 years as a weak adventurer and now is dead. He's one of the rare adventurers who can use spirit energy, mana, and divine power, but since he's trash, they're all basic. He wished he could be strong and achieve his goal of becoming Mythril class, which is the highest adventurer class. Yet, he decides that being a skeleton won't stop him from reaching his dream. He starts taking out more monsters and realizes he's getting stronger than when he was a human. After defeating another slime, Rentt notices the power seems quite different. Suddenly, his body starts to change, creating muscles, hair, skin, and even eyes. He realizes he managed to evolve into a ghoul, and he can now make sounds with his mouth. He feels happy that he finally has some flesh hugging his bones despite it being pretty dry. However, this makes him realize that if he keeps working hard, he might be able to become a high-rank undead like a vampire. He first decides to speak some words, but all that comes out is a roar. With some training, he manages to say hello and good morning. However, he still needs to practice to sound less like a zombie. Rentt is fighting off some goblins inside the dungeon. He knows that goblins can be dangerous in groups, so he uses the dungeon's layout to spread them out and force them into a 1v1. He easily defeats them and takes a look at himself. He evolved into a ghoul, and they meant he could now strengthen his sword as well as himself. The goblins decide to attack again, but he swings his sword and defeats them easily. He hears the clang of swords in the distance, and he's not too happy about that. In another part of the dungeon, a girl is fighting off skeleton monsters, but she looks exhausted. She strikes at the skeleton 3 times before she finally defeats it. She proceeds deeper into the dungeon, and Rentt watches her. It has been long since he saw another human in the dungeon. He wants to go and meet her, but he reminds himself he can't go out like that because he's a ghoul and she'll either kill him or run away at the sight of him. He decides to watch her from a distance as she collects the drop items from the skeleton. He doesn't recognize her, so he thinks she must be a rookie since he knows most of the adventurers in the city. The knowledge Rentt has about the other adventurers' abilities usually comes in handy. As the girl goes deeper into the dungeon, Rentt follows her slowly. She goes down a corridor, and a skeleton monster forms behind her. She engages it in combat, and Rentt observes her technique. He notices that she has good form, but she's weak, so she has to land multiple blows on the monster and dodge a lot of its attacks to defeat it. Her one flaw is she didn't observe her surroundings, and the skeleton monster backs her against the wall. She encourages herself and strikes at the skeleton once again, but it grips her sword and pushes her against the wall. It is about to attack her, and Rentt has no choice but to step in. He comes out screaming to get the skeleton's attention, and the skeleton faces him. Rentt was hoping the girl would attack the skeleton from behind, but she was too stunned to do so. The skeleton tries to attack him, but he uses his divinity skill and takes it down in one fell swoop. He tries to approach her and talk to her, but she's horrified by his appearance. He tries to introduce himself, but his voice just makes her even more horrified. She tells him to stay away from her, and he tells her he's not her enemy. He throws his sword down and raises his arms to assure her. She notices he's not a mere ghoul, and Rentt tells her he's an adventurer. She asks him if he is disguising for Halloween since he looks like a ghoul. He tells her he actually passed away, but he's still somehow alive. She thanks him for saving her life, and he tells her he had to because adventurers look out for each other. She still doesn't trust him, so she asks him not to take her life away. He assures her that he won't do that, but he needs her to help him get some clothes. He tells her that he wants to go back to the city of Malt, and she tells him she could get him a robe that hides his body. He puts a bag of coins on the ground and tells her to keep the change after getting the clothes. He walks back, and she moves forward to pick up the bag. He begs her to help him, and she introduces herself to him as Rena. She tells him she's a daughter of a knight, and she would repay her debt to him. He leads her back to the entrance of the dungeon, and she tells him she will be back for him. Rentt notices her cautiousness around him, and he thinks she's acting just like a proper adventurer. Typically, a proper adventurer would report the sight of a ghoul to the guild for immediate action, but he doesn't think she'll betray him. Rentt doesn't want to double her, but he thinks if he turns out to be wrong, he'll deal with the consequences when they arise. He goes back into the dungeon. Rena goes back to the city and meets up with Sheila. Sheila tells her she's glad she's not hurt and that she was worried about her since she didn't come back after sunset. Rena tells her a lot has happened and she has an urgent question for her. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, Rentt is engaged in combat with a glob monster. He can't believe how powerful he has become compared to when he was human. The monster throws some globs at Rentt, but he dodges it. He notices he's not just stronger, but his body also moves just as he wants it to. He strikes at the moving core of the monster and destroys it easily. The monster melts to the ground. Rentt thinks his combat intuition is also better because he was able to predict the movement of the monster's core. This is something that can't be gotten from training or studying, and Rentt is surprised he only got that power after he became a ghoul. Suddenly, he hears Rena's voice calling his name. He goes out to meet her, and he's surprised she actually came back for him. She's standing with a sack on the floor in front of her. As he approaches him, she pulls out her sword and takes a few steps back, asking him if he's Rentt or a random ghoul. He tells her he's Rentt and that ghouls don't show up in the early levels of the dungeon. She eases up, and she tells Rentt he has gotten better at talking. He tells her he practiced while she was away, and she commends him for that. She shows him the sack containing his robe and walks towards it to put down his change. He walks towards the sack and she backs up. Rentt looks at her and she apologizes, telling him she's still a bit scared. She tells him she needs more time to get used to him, and he tells her it's fine for her to feel like that. He tells her he wants to have a look at the clothes, and he opens up the sack. He picks up the robe and takes a look at it. It was a plain color robe that wouldn't draw a second glance from anyone, and it would cover his whole body, making him look like a mage. Rentt liked the robe, and he tells Rentt it's perfect. She tells him she also bought other things she thought he might need. She tells him she just got to Malt, so she had to ask someone to show her the best shops. Rentt brings out a pair of gloves and shoes from the sack and some bandages. She tells him she bought those to hide his arms and legs from sight. Rentt thinks Rentt is very kind, and her gesture almost brings him to tears, but he's not capable of shedding tears. His demeanor worries Rentt, but he tells her he's fine. He tries the clothes on, and he immediately gets a glow-up. It's much easier for Rentt to move in the clothes than he thought it would be. Though the hood makes him lose some visibility, he has enough to fight off monsters. She asks him how the clothes feel, and he tells her they're perfect. She tells him he looks imposing, like a very powerful mage. She holds up a mirror for him to look at his face, and he tells her he stands out too much. He tries to pull down the hoodie, but it's not big enough. Rentt brings out a mask from the sack and asks Rentt if he would like to try it. He asks her what that is, and she tells him she thought it would be a bad idea for him to go into town looking like that, so she got the mask. He picks it up and observes it. She tells him she thought he was a special type monster when she first saw him. He tells her she may be right. As he holds the mask to his face, it attaches itself magically. Rentt tells him he looks great, but he tries to get the mask off, and it doesn't come off. He tells her he can't get it off, and she apologizes. She tells him she got it at a market stall and it looked suspicious. He asks her if the stall wasn't part of the shops the guild took her to, and she tells him the guild didn't take her to the stall and the mask is the only thing she bought from there. She tells him it was shockingly cheap, and she checked for curses when she touched it, but nothing happened. Rentt figures out that the curse only activates when someone puts the mask on. He tells her he wants to try something, and he activates his divinity skill. Rentt is shocked to see he can use divinity, and he tells her he can only use it for a bit. He's convinced he can break a basic curse with the skill, and he holds up his hand in front of the mask. He runs out of energy, and they're both bummed out. Rentt apologizes once again for bringing him a cursed item, but he tells her it's fine since he has to hide his face anyway. He tells her the mask responded to divinity, and he just has to hire a cleric to break the curse. Rentt walks up to her, trying to reassure her by patting her shoulder, but he thinks he may be too intrusive and back up. She grabs his hand and tells him he's a good person, and she's not scared of him anymore. He holds her hand and tells her she doesn't have to force herself to like him till she gets used to him eventually. She tells him it won't take long for that to happen. She tells him they can now head back to the city, and they leave the dungeon. They enter a carriage, and Rentt tells him she registered as a guild in the capital city, but there were many popular adventurers there. Because she was a rookie, she didn't get any jobs, so someone recommended she go to Malt. He tells her he's surprised she came all the way to the countryside, and she tells him she wanted to see the outside world. She also tells him she wants to get stronger and become a proper adventurer in no time. Rentt tells her he understands her point, but an adventurer should be cautious because everyone only has one life. They finally arrive at the city, but Rentt is reluctant to follow Rentt. She asks him what's wrong, and he tells her a lot of people in the city know him. He tells her they'll know something is wrong if he shows them his ID at the gate. She asks him if they can go through another gate, and he tells her there's one that's not frequently used. She tells him they better head for that gate, but he thanks her, saying he only made it thus far because of her. She tells him not to act like that was goodbye, because she will keep helping him even after he crosses the gate. He tells her, though he needs someone to help him, if she helps him get inside, she would be considered a criminal because he's a monster. He tells her she may lose her adventurer's license, and he doesn't want to cause her any trouble. She tells him she'll risk her life for him because without him she won't be alive. They go over to the other gate, and they ask them to present their IDs. One of the guards looks at it, and they let Rentt pass. As Rentt is about to pass, they question his weird appearance. They ask him if he's ever been to Malt, but he doesn't reply. They ask him to take off the mask so they see his face, but Rentt tells them the mask is cursed and he can't take it off. They ask her if that's why he talks weirdly too, and she says he was fatally injured while fighting a monster. He shows them part of his ears, and they're surprised by how scarred it is. Rentt tells Time he bought the mask to hide his scars, but the mask turned out to be cursed. Rentt tells them to try to pull the mask off themselves, and one of the guards tries, but he can't get it off. Rentt tells them they want to donate some money to a church and get a cleric to help them remove the mask. The guards allow Rentt to pass, and Rentt thanks Rentt. Rentt is distracted by a carriage, and Rentt uses that opportunity to disappear. Rentt begins looking for him, but he hides on the roof. Rentt doesn't want to ruin her guild life, so he decides to stay away from her. Later at night, Rentt goes to a house in search of a human cooperator. Since he couldn't work with Rentt, he had to find someone who could keep secrets. It knocks on the door, but no one answers, so he lets himself in. A woman is sleeping on the couch, and he tries to wake her up. Lorraine tells him to let her sleep evermore, but he threatens to drop a book on her head. She sits up and is shocked by his weird appearance. She thinks it's just a mask, but he takes off his glove to show her his ghoul hand. She asks him what happened. Lorraine is contemplating putting up a search request at the Adventurer Guild. Suddenly, she hears a familiar knock on the door, and she knows it's Rentt. But Rentt doesn't enter immediately, so she knows something must have happened to him, but she's glad he's alive. She lies down on the couch and pretends to be asleep. Rentt opens the door, and he comes over to the couch to wake her up. She tells him to allow her to sleep some more, but he threatens to wake her up in a brutal way. She finally opens her eyes to look at Rentt, and she realizes he's now a ghoul. Rentt tells her the story of what happened to him, but Lorraine doesn't believe him. She has been researching monsters and magic, and she had never come across a scenario where someone was turned into an undead after being eaten by a dragon. She asks him if the dragon is still in the labyrinth, and he tells her the dragon is probably already gone. Lorraine has no choice but to believe his story because of how he now looks. Rentt is surprised by how calm Lorraine is after seeing his body up close, but he feels like she'll treat him as a research subject rather than a friend. Lorraine paces for a while thinking, and suddenly, she asks Rentt if he still remembers his identity now that he's undead. Rentt tells her he still has the memories and consciousness of himself before he became an undead. But that doesn't change the fact that he's lost his life once. He tells her he's not very sure he's still the same person, and she tells him that's exactly how the Rentt she knows would reply. Though it's still hard to confirm he's the same person, she tells him they'll worry about that later. She asks him what he plans to do with his life, and he tells her he wants to continue living as an adventurer. He aims to achieve the highest rank in the guild, but he knows he can't go to the guild looking like an undead. Lorraine figures out that he needs her to take up quests for him, and he'll have to crash at her place for a while. She asks him if that's okay with him, and he tells her he's fine with that. But she asks for his help with her research. She doesn't want to miss the opportunity to examine a subject that underwent an existential evolution. Rentt tells her he's fine with it as long as she doesn't dissect him. She tells him she's not Frankenstein, but she'll need a little bit of skin once in a while. The next day, Rentt is doing some chores when Lorraine comes back to the house. She tells him she went to the guild, and she gives him the payment for the slime liquids and magic crystals he got from the labyrinth. Rentt thinks he was overpaid for the resources, but she tells him they were of good quality and the guild will put them to good use. He takes the payment and tells her he will be going to see an infamous blacksmith. Later in the day, Rentt walks through the market district, happy his wallet is so full. As he walks along the street, he draws the gaze of other people who are shopping. He notices their gaze fixed on him, and he tries to hide his face better. He finally arrives at the blacksmith shop, and he's welcomed by the receptionist. She notices his outfit, and she's a bit surprised. Rentt apologizes for his suspicious look. She asks him what he wants, and he drops his sword on the counter and tells her he needs a new one. She unsheathes the sword and looks at its edges. She notices the sword was treated well, but it has been overused. She asks him if he uses magic or spirit energy, and he tells her he uses mana, spirit, and divinity magic. She is surprised he is thrice blessed because they are very rare. She tells him there's only one other customer who is thrice blessed, and Rentt asks her to keep his a secret. He presents her with a bag of coins asking if it would be sufficient. She tells him it'll suffice, but he only has to pay half first, then pay the balance after the sword is ready. But she warns him that her husband is a perfectionist, and he would need several days to make the sword. She also tells him her husband may call him several times to get his opinions on how he wants his sword to look. He tells her he doesn't mind, and that they can reach him if they contact Lorraine's place. Meanwhile, Lorraine is at home reading a book about ghouls. She finds out their preferred meals and how they are formed. She also finds out that ghouls which are turned by other powerful monsters tend to lose their memories and human emotions. She closes the book as she now knows that Rentt's case is very special. She's still not sure he is the same person he was before he was turned, but he still feels like the same Rentt she has always known. She remembered when she was younger and she took a quest at the guild. A man stopped her and found out her quest would be taking her to a forest far away from the city. He offers up young Rentt to be her pack-bearer for free so he can gain some experience since he was still a rookie. They arrive at the forest and Lorraine is in search of a particular herb, but she can't find it. She wonders if her quest description texts were wrong. Back then the world was boring to Lorraine, and though she was the youngest to attain the title of Great Doctor, it didn't mean much to her. But the title allowed her to register as a silver rank adventurer. After getting the title, she quickly left for the city of Yorlin to gather some herbs since she had nothing better to do. She finally found the herb she was looking for, and she harvested it carefully to preserve its usefulness. She packed it up and told young Rentt to put it in her pack. He takes the pack to her, and she's surprised to find it almost full with the same herbs she had been struggling to find. She asks him how he was able to find the herb and harvest it correctly, but Rentt is distracted by something in the forest. She glances at the direction he's looking at to see a goblin notching an arrow into its bow. Young Rentt raises his shield to defend her, and he tells her to use a spell against the goblin. She uses the spell to completely obliterate the goblin. Young Rentt praises her magic level, but she tells him it's nothing special. After the battle, he offers her some water, asking if that was her first battle. She tells him it was not, but her escorts aren't usually as experienced. She realizes that young Rentt is more than a pack-bearer. He tells her the other adventurers were worried she didn't have enough experience for her rank, so they told him to follow her. She asked him how he knew so much about herbs. He told her someone advised him to read about everything he could find concerning herbs and monsters if he wanted to become a good adventurer. This was when they first introduced themselves to each other, and they became friends. Lorraine asks him to teach her all he knows about herbs and how to fight. She noticed he knew exactly how to move through the forest, and she asked him for the trick behind it. He promised to teach her everything, and he worked hard for 10 years since they'd known each other, trying to achieve the highest adventure rank. Lorraine stayed by his side doing the research she had loved all this time. She now sees why the elders were worried about her years ago. She realizes she hasn't been replying to her letter because didn't want some old men to lecture her. She gets up from her chair, wondering where she kept her unread letters. Rentt meets with the blacksmith, and he thanks him for making him a new sword. The blacksmith promises to make him something special, and they shake on it. His wife presents Rentt with a temporary sword to use before his own is ready. The sword can only use mana and spirit energy. He takes the sword and leaves. The blacksmith tells his wife Rentt may be in some trouble, and she wonders why he didn't ask for their help. The husband tells her he's probably suffering from a curse and he doesn't want it to affect their shop. He figured out that Rentt didn't want to cause trouble for other people. He asks his wife for the information Rentt shared with her, and she tells him. He tells her they may get him to talk about his curse one day since he will be frequenting their shop. Rentt returns home and he makes dinner for him and Lorraine. Lorraine enjoys his cooking, and he tells her she can't have seconds if she wants. She notices he hasn't touched his dinner, and he tells her he doesn't get hungry. She takes that as a good sign. She tells him she was studying about ghouls while he was away, and she tells him he's different from an average ghoul. That's the reason he can evolve, and she asks him what he will become next. He tells her he just wants to be as human as possible, so he'll just aim for his next existential evolution. Lorraine figures out he has to return to the labyrinth, and he tells her he has to destroy monsters to evolve faster. The next day, an adventurer is fighting a slime monster in the labyrinth, but he's no match for it. He's about to be completely overwhelmed by the monster, but it suddenly melts away. Rentt saves the man, and the man thanks him. He tells Rentt he didn't expect the slime to attack like that, and though he got a little cut, he'll be fine. Rentt begins to walk away since adventurers are expected to take care of themselves. The man tries to stop Rentt, but Rentt doesn't listen to him. Rentt had heard of people who pretend to be in a sticky situation and then rob those who help them. The man runs in front of Rentt and asks to join his party. He tells him he needs the money because he just registered as an adventurer and can't even fight a slime. Rentt tells him slimes are strong, and they always give swordsmen a tough time. The man tells Rentt he's a chef and he has a restaurant. He's in a huge debt that he needs to repay by the next week. He told every adventurer he met he'll do anything they ask as long as they let him join their party, but no one gave him a chance. He decided to explore the labyrinth by himself, but only strong people can do that and get away with it. Rentt tells him he's too busy, and the man watches him walk away. Rentt would have loved to let the man join him, but he didn't see him with any useful magic items. He suddenly has an idea, and he tells the man he can tag along as long as he's okay with carrying a pack. The man suddenly rushes to follow Rentt, happy to finally join a party. Rentt doesn't know if the guy is a good or a bad guy, but he figures it can't hurt to help someone. The man tells Rentt he will do whatever he commands. They keep walking through the labyrinth, and they get to a part that the man thinks is a dead end, but Rentt tells him to trust him. The man is surprised to see a corridor that the map says is a dead end. They walk through the corridor and arrive at an opening, and the man is surprised such a place exists in the labyrinth. Rentt is even more surprised that there's no dragon in sight. They explore the opening and Rentt is disappointed. He didn't find any magic items. The man calls out to Rentt, telling him he found a little gap on the walls. They look through the gap to find a hidden corridor. The man tells Rentt they can make a fortune if they tell the guild about the secret passage. He tells Rentt he'll tell everyone it was Rentt who found it, but Rentt tells him he's not interested in glory and the man can take the credit for finding it. Rentt enters the passage and asks the man to follow him. They find an empty room and the man enters it. He tells Rentt they can look for another secret passage or a hidden treasure since no one had ever come to that section before. Rentt tells him to wait, but he doesn't hear Rentt over his babbling. Rentt enters the room and a teleportation circle activates at the center of the room. He tries to warn the man, but the man tells him not to worry because there are no monsters in sight. Rentt realizes the man can't see the circle, and he tries to stop him, but he steps on it and he's teleported away. Rentt knows a teleportation circle leads to a room filled with monsters or traps, and he considers leaving the man to his fate. But he doesn't want to be more of a monster than he already is. He steps on the circle, which teleports him to a dark room. He sees the man on the floor, and he tries to help him, but he hears the feet of a monster stomp on the ground. A giant skeleton appears from the shadows, and Rentt realizes the skeleton is an area boss. Rentt has no choice but to face the huge undead skeleton. He tries a spirit attack on it, but it's ineffective. The skeleton tries to strike back, but Rentt dodges away. He decides to try a mana attack, but it's also ineffective against the skeleton. The skeleton tries to counterattack, but Rentt gets out of the way. Now Rentt is getting desperate. He looks for an escape route, but the entrance is sealed. Since he's in a boss room, he'll have to defeat the skeleton before he can get out. Rentt curses his bad luck as the skeleton starts approaching him. Rentt remembers the adventurer's code never to give up regardless of the situation. Though Rentt is not sure his sword can handle it, he decides to use his divinity skill. He attacks the skeleton with the skill and he takes out its leg. The skeleton loses its balance and falls to the ground, and Rentt uses that opportunity to run up its spine and land a final blow on the skeleton's skull. He tends to his follower's wounds and the man wakes up. He remembers there was a huge skeleton before he passed out, and he almost panics. Rentt tells him he can only do basic first aid and can't heal his wounds fully. The man looks around and sees the remains of the skeleton. He asks Rentt if he defeated the skeleton alone, and Rentt shows him the huge magical crystal the skeleton dropped. The man figured out that the monster was very tough for it to drop such a huge crystal. He commends Rentt for being skillful enough to defeat the monster solo. Rentt tells him it was just luck, and he tells the man he'll hand him the crystal if he wants. His follower can't believe his ears, but Rentt tells him it'll come at a price. His follower asks Rentt what he wants in return because he feels he can't be of much use to Rentt after seeing how strong an adventurer he is. Rentt shows the man he's now a ghoul after being attacked by the dragon in the past. He tells the man he can't enter the shops in the guild because of that, so he'll need him to do that in his stead. The man agrees to it, but he feels the deal is too good to be true because he's getting so much out of it for so little. Rentt decided to add one more thing to the deal. He asks the man to give him free meals at his restaurant anytime he wants. The man is brought to tears by this request, and he tells Rentt he can eat as much as he wants anytime he wants. He promises to work hard to make sure he doesn't go bankrupt. He thanks Rentt for the opportunity, and Rentt hands him the crystal, telling him it's time to go home. The man asks Rentt how they'll get out of the labyrinth, and Rentt points him in a direction. The man tells Rentt he can't see anything, and Rentt is surprised the man can't see the room. Rentt tells his follower that they can return to their former location if they go towards that direction, and he believes Rentt. He moves towards it and he's teleported back. Rentt looks back to see another rune leading to another room, and he decides to come back later to explore it. They return to the city and Rentt's disciple takes him to his restaurant named the Red Dragon Pavilion. The places looked better than Rentt envisioned. Suddenly, the man's wife rushes out and hugs him, glad to see him alive and well. She notices his wounds and she tells him he needs to go see a doctor ASAP. He tells Isabel, his wife, that Rentt healed him after he was hurt. Isabel didn't notice Rentt before and she apologizes for being oblivious. Her husband tells her Rentt saved his life and he shows her the crystal Rentt gave him. Isabel tells him he can't take the crystal, wondering if he hasn't learned his lesson from his past. She tells him they won't be able to foot their bill if they get scammed again. He reassures her that Rentt is too kind a person to pull a scam on them. He recounts how he told Rentt about their debt and he offered to help. He tells her Rentt isn't doing it for free and he'll be offering his services to Rentt in compensation. She asks him if he'll be doing anything dangerous and he tells her it'll just be simple errands. He tells her he promised Rentt free meals at their restaurant and she wonders if all that's enough to make the deal even. He tells her it was enough to make the deal and he apologizes for worrying her. The man figures out that Rentt is yet to know his name and he introduces himself as Loris. They both thank him for helping them and Rentt bids them goodbye. He turns and starts walking away, but Loris doesn't want him to go without telling him his name. Rentt turns back and asks him to promise not to tell anyone. Loris promises to keep it a secret and to only call him boss. Rentt tells Loris his name and Loris tells him they'll always give him a warm welcome at their restaurant. Rentt is on his way home and he thinks it was unfortunate that Loris wasn't a liar and a crook. His vision starts turning red as he thinks it would have been better for him that way. He was hoping to try out something sinister on some bad guys. He arrives at their cottage and his vision gets even more static. He wonders what he's thinking as he falls to his knees and calls Lorraine's name in a sinister voice. He walks into the house with his vision completely covered in red. Lorraine asks him if he encountered the dragon at the labyrinth and he tells her he didn't. She asks him where he kept the letters from the capital so she can reply to whoever wrote to her. Rentt answers her, but she notices he sounds different. She asks him if anything happened to him and he tells her he's in a good mood. Lorraine is about to ask if something good happened to him, but he just hugs her out of the blue. She wonders if he's drunk, but then she remembers an undead cannot get drunk. Lorraine is enjoying the moment when suddenly Rentt bares his teeth and sinks them into her neck. She pushes him off her, wondering if the real Rentt is still somewhere inside his body. Rentt is surprised by how delicious her juice is, but she calls his name and he regains himself. She uses her magic to knock him down and put him to sleep. She tells him she doesn't mind him eating her as long as he does it when he's sober. Rentt wakes up later at night with a splitting headache. He remembers being in the labyrinth with Loris. Lorraine asks him if he feels controlled by any creature or some unnatural impulse. He tells her he's not being controlled and Lorraine is relieved. He apologizes to Lorraine, but Lorraine sums it up as an unfortunate accident. Rentt tries to tell her it's more than that, but she stops him from talking. She asks him how much he remembers before he blacked out, and he tells her he remembers attacking her. He tells her he remembers meeting a man at the labyrinth, and then he talked about an appetizing meal. That was when he lost control, and once he saw Lorraine, he thought she was too delicious to pass up. She tells him it's right for a ghoul to crave a human. She asks him if he remained unhurt after she hit him with her magic, and he tells her he's all right. She tells him to get some rest, and she tells him she'll also get some rest. She's walking to her room, but he tells her he wants to see where he hurt her. She draws back her cloth to reveal the bite mark. She tells him she's out healing potions, but she'll make one the following day. Rentt heals the wound, and she's surprised to see he can use his divinity skill to that extent. He tells her he can heal minor injuries, and she tells him the healing sensation is very pleasant. Rentt finishes healing her, and she takes off the bandage. Rentt can still see some bite marks, and he decides to heal her even more. Lorraine notices he's looking different. He takes off his clothes to look at himself, and she tells him he can tell people the scars on his body are from old battles. He looks at his face in the mirror, and he's surprised to see his mask has also changed. The lower half of his face is showing, and Rentt tells Lorraine that part should remain hidden. The mask responds by hiding the power part of his face and showing just the upper part of his face. Lorraine wonders if the mask is reacting to his will, and Rentt changes the mask to show his lower face. Lorraine asks him if he can remove the mask now that it follows his will. Rentt tries removing it, but it remains stuck. Lorraine also tries pulling it off his face, but it doesn't budge. She's confused by this, but since he still looks like an undead, she figures it's best the mask stays on. The mask changes back to cover his lower face, and Rentt tells her he would leave it like that for the time being. Lorraine also notices that Rentt's voice is much clearer now, and he wonders if he went through an existential evolution. He's confused about why his evolution was delayed because the last time he evolved was right after he defeated a monster. Lorraine wonders if his evolution was caused by the consumption of her flesh and blood. She tells him the idea isn't so far-fetched because he now looks more like a thrall than a ghoul. Thralls are monsters who are servants of vampires. They're ranked lower than vampires, and Lorraine tells Rentt he looks very similar to one. Rentt wonders why he would evolve into a thrall, and Lorraine tells him the concept of existential evolution is still a mystery to scholars. She tells him she has a hypothesis and tells him not to fall asleep while she explains it to him. She follows his evolution from a skeleton to a ghoul and asks him if it wasn't a weird change. Rentt is lost, and she explains that existential evolution involves a monster turning into a higher rank of itself. She wonders if the ghoul is the only higher-ranking version of a skeleton. Rentt tells her there are skeleton knights and skeleton soldiers, which are higher versions of the skeleton. Lorraine tells him that there have been stories of skeletons changing to ghouls, but nobody knows if it was by chance or for a certain reason. She tells him her theory is he wanted to become a particular monster, and he was thinking in that direction during his evolution. Rentt realized that he wanted to become something more human, like during his latest transformation. He wonders why he turned into a ghoul instead of a vampire, which looks closer to a human. Lorraine tells him it could be similar to the guild system rank, and he has to meet certain criteria to evolve. Lorraine explains that when they carried out experiments on lesser animals, it was determined that their evolution was determined by their environment. She tells him it may not have been the environment of the creatures, but the creatures themselves that caused their evolution. She tells him that may be the ability he has. He understands that if he tries hard enough, he can become a vampire and eventually become a human again. She tells him she's not sure he can become a human again. She tells him he may need to do more than slay monsters to achieve his next existential evolution. He understands that he would need to meet many more conditions to become a vampire. He tells Lorraine there is a lot they don't know about his evolution, and she tells him their discussion was just a hypothesis because they're not even sure of all they said. She tells him the best bet is to take things step by step, and she offers to help him through his journey. He thanks her for offering her help. She tells him it's time for him to become a lab rat, and she tells him to take off his clothes. She tells him all she'll do to him to find out all she needs to know about him. Rentt is horrified by the thought of it all, but she tells him they'll start the experiment the following day. Rentt is surprised by this, and Lorraine tells him it's common sense to know he's already tired. The next day, Lorraine is still sleeping, but Rentt is already outside swinging his sword to find out how his body feels. He's convinced he feels fine, but he looks at his sword to see its edge jagged. He can't go into the labyrinth with such a sword, and he knows Clope would be upset when he takes it to him. He takes it to Clope, and Clope tells him the sword is irreparable. Rentt apologizes for infusing the sword with divinity. Clope now understands why the sword was so battered. He tells Rentt there shouldn't be any monsters nearby that require divinity to be defeated, and Rentt tells him he encountered a giant skeleton in an uncharted territory. Clope can't believe his ears, and now he understands why Rentt has such a weird equipment set. He asks Rentt if he fully explored the territory, and Rentt tells him he's yet to do that. He asks Clope if he can finish his sword as soon as possible. Clope was already expecting his request, and he tells Rentt his sword is not even close to being finished. He gives him a replacement for his battered sword, but this one is slightly better. Rentt leaves the shop, happy he got a replacement. As Rentt is walking down the street, he spots Isabel and Loris buying foodstuff to prepare meals at their restaurant. Loris announces to everyone that the Red Dragon Pavilion would be reopening that day. Rentt is happy to hear this, and he walks away silently. Lorraine explains to Rentt how alchemy can make things which are naturally harmless to humans fatal, not just to them but to larger animals as well. Rentt is intrigued by the principle of alchemy, and though he previously agreed to go along with Lorraine's experiment, he begins to reconsider for fear of his life. Lorraine mixes up a poison that Rentt tries out. He begins to make guttural sounds, and Lorraine asks if she should cast the antidote spell. He tells her the poison didn't harm him, but its taste was awful. She tells him he's probably the only one who's lived to complain of the taste of the poison. Lorraine can now conclude that Rentt is immune to poison, but somehow he can still make use of herbs and potions. She envies his body, but she's getting sleepy. She asks Rentt if he would need to get some sleep now that he's a thrall. He tells her he's fine with very little sleep, and Lorraine envies his body even more. She asks him how his appetite is, and he tells her that he still faintly craves human meat and juice. She hands him a vial, and he asks if it's another kind of poison. She tells him to open it and find out. Rentt opens it and sniffs its contents, and he's surprised to smell human juice. Lorraine tells him it's her juice, which she kept put into the vial and preserved with magic. Though she knows Rentt is opposed to consuming human juice, she tells him he has to consume it regularly so he doesn't go berserk. Rentt pours a drop on his finger and he locks it off. He's surprised by how sweet it tastes, and Lorraine asks him if he's satisfied with just one drop. He tells her that drop was enough to quench his thirst, and he'll savor the rest bit by bit. Rentt tells Lorraine he wants to head out, and he advises her to get some sleep. She asks him if he's going back to the labyrinth, and he tells her he'll go there, but he will stop by the guild first. Lorraine wonders what he's going to be doing at the guild, and he tells her he's going there to take a request. She tells him if he's going there to take a request, he has to show his adventurer certificate, which contains his name. She tells him his look will cause chaos in the guild. Rentt tells her, though he looks a lot different than he used to, nobody would pay him much attention since he's just a bronze rank adventurer. She tells him his rank is irrelevant because the guild thinks too highly of him because of what he has done for them. She's sure they will surely notice a change in his appearance. Rentt tries to downplay it as minor errands, but she tells him he's thinking too low of himself. She tells him there have been rumors that the guild wants to recruit him as a staffer. Rentt tells her the rumors didn't reach his ears. He wonders why they want to pick him instead of an accomplished adventurer. She tells him they probably didn't tell him because he wasn't planning to retire just yet. Rentt asks her how she knows so much about that, and she tells him she has several acquaintances in the guild. Rentt tells her he would be thankful for such an offer from the guild, but he has no interest in retiring and becoming a staffer. Lorraine knew that was going to be his answer, and she wondered what their next step should be. For Rentt to rank up, he needs to pass the rank promotional exam, but to do that he needs to attain some achievements before he can take the exam. The achievement requires him to take requests in his name, but if the guild finds out about his current state, that would be the end of his adventure life. Lorraine gets an idea, and she tells Rentt to change his identity, and Rentt is shocked by her idea. The next day, Rentt walks into the guild wearing his full costume and looking quite mysterious. He draws the glances of some adventurers as he enters. He looks around and he feels nostalgic, remembering the last time he entered the guild. He spots Sheila, and he's glad to see she's doing well. She notices him and asks him if he's new to the guild. He approaches her and tells her he wants to register as a new adventurer. She hands him a form to fill, and she tells him she can fill the other information saved for his name. He tells her he can write, and she apologizes for assuming he's illiterate. She tells him he only needs to fill in the needed information, and he can leave the other parts empty. She tells him to write his specialities and the kind of magic so they can give him more requests. Rentt remembers when he first filled out the form 10 years ago. Back then he didn't even know what his specialty was, and he ended up writing only his name and age. But since then his convictions haven't changed. He recalls the previous night when Lorraine suggested he register under a different name, and he told her double registration is against the rules. She told him that there's no way for the guild to confirm that he's the same person, and even if they found out, it won't be a big deal. She told him if he told them his name, they would want to find out why he looked so different. She told him if he goes as a wanderer that wants to become an adventurer, they won't ask about his suspicious outlook. Rentt agreed with her, and she told him it was too bad he couldn't transfer his previous achievements. She told him he would have to start as an iron rank adventurer. Rentt told her he didn't mind because his goal remained the same. His goal is to one day become a Mythril rank adventurer. He submits the form to Sheila, who looks at his name, and she's surprised he's named Rentt Vivi. He asks her why she's surprised, and she tells him an adventurer named recently went missing. He asks her if she's talking about Rentt Faina, and she tells him that's who she's talking about. She asks him how he knows about Rentt, and he tells her he heard it from Lorraine. She asks him if he's related to Lorraine, and he tells her they are related and he's lodging with her. She tells him she heard a strange person was visiting Lorraine regularly, and she secretly hoped it was Rentt. She tells Rentt he filled out the form properly. She tells him to wait for her while she handles the registration procedure. Rentt is glad he told her he was related to Lorraine. He didn't want the rumors to ruin her reputation. Rentt is positive he can start afresh since his name is very common, and it's not strange to see adventurers with a weird getup. Sheila comes back and hands him his ID card, telling him he's now an Iron Rank adventurer. She tells him to take care of himself, and he takes his ID card and walks away. He goes to the labyrinth, and he hears a screech somewhere in the labyrinth. He wonders if it's a goblin. Then he hears the voices of some adventurers engaged in a battle close by. The voice sounds like a young person, and Rentt moves to the direction it's coming from. He finds the two adventurers battling a goblin. The male adventurer is a swordsman, and the female is a healer. Judging by their looks, he figures out that they are novices. Rentt can see they work well together, so he decides to leave them be and walk away. Rentt used to help greenhorns around the labyrinth, but he can't anymore because his current appearance would scare them. Rentt decides to go back to the hidden room before someone else finds it. Rentt knows information about undiscovered parts of the labyrinth is valuable, so he wants to explore the hidden area and report it to the guild. This would be an achievement, especially for someone with such a low rank. He walks to the teleportation circle on the other side of the room, and he's teleported to another room. He walks into the room and looks around to see children's toys on the floor. He tries to pick up a teddy bear, but it scatters in his hands. He walks further into the room and goes through some curtains. He sees a skeleton lying on the bed, but it doesn't look like an undead. He's surprised to find out someone is living inside the labyrinth. He tries to pick up the flower beside the skeleton when someone suddenly speaks up behind him. The lady asks him what he's doing, and he doesn't like his chances with her. He tells her he was searching the room for something valuable since he's an adventurer. She tells him he was searching for something to steal, and she asks him if he's willing to lose his life for it. She tells him there are some things she can't forgive, and one of those is having her place disturbed. She attacks Rentt, and he tries to use his divinity to block it, but the attack is too powerful and pushed back into the wall. His clothes disintegrate, and he's hurt by her attack, but he manages to get back on his feet. The lady is surprised by how his body looks, and he tells her didn't end up like that of his own volition. Though she wanted to attack again, she now understands how Rentt managed to enter the room, and she relaxes. She apologizes to him for misunderstanding him and burning his clothes. She gives him her coat to compensate, and she tells him to keep the place a secret because it's special. She tells him no other person can enter the room unless he's with them, and she gives him an acacia map so he doesn't return empty-handed. Rentt opens the map, but it's empty. She tells him the map magically records anywhere where its owner has traveled through. She tells him their trade is complete, and she will be sending him back to the entrance. She tells him she would wish him good health, but it won't be of any use to him in his current condition. Rentt's vision becomes fuzzy, and he wakes up at the entrance of the labyrinth. He returns to Lorraine and explains everything to her. She asks him if he's under some kind of curse because of the things that happened to him. He tells her it's not his fault he's running into them, and she tells him that's why she said he's cursed. She looks at the map, and she tells him it's safe to use. He asks her how to use it, and she tells him it didn't react to her magic. She tells him to try his magic, and when he does, the map becomes filled. Rentt recognizes it as the labyrinth of the moon's reflection, and Lorraine is amazed. She notices a mark and asks Rentt what it is, but Rentt doesn't know. He points at it, and it shows names, and Rentt recognizes the names as a pair of new adventurers he saw in the labyrinth. Lorraine figures out that the map is showing the names of people in the labyrinth and their positions. Lorraine can't believe how valuable the map is. She asks Rentt if he can bring up the path of other labyrinths, and he tries bringing up the map of another labyrinth. The map changes, but it's not complete, and Rentt remembers the lady said the map only records places he has been to. Rentt asks her to take a look at the robe to make sure it's not cursed, and she tells him he would know if it's cursed since he already has it equipped. She tells him the robe is of good quality with high magic resistance and good defense. She tells him its defense is more than regular armor, and he tells her he got a good deal out of his expedition. She tells him he should be more worried about the identity of the woman who almost sent him to meet his ancestors. He tells her he doesn't know the lady's identity, but she is very powerful. He thinks she would be stronger than a gold-class adventurer. She tells him she's curious about the room he found because it means someone can make living spaces in a labyrinth. Rentt tells her he would visit the labyrinth the next day, and she commends him for being brave despite him almost losing his life. He tells her the lady didn't tell him not to return. She only told him not to tell the guild about the room. Lorraine tells him it seems the lady wants to be left alone, and he tells her he'll just go back to talk. He goes to the labyrinth the next day, and he reflects on Lorraine's words about him being cursed. He remembers the day he met the dragon and got cursed, and how he can't take off the cursed mask. He knows most people would pity him, but he sees his situation as an opportunity to get stronger and get the highest adventurer rank. He arrives at the entrance, but the entrance is gone. He looks at the map, but that area is empty, and he figures out that the lady doesn't want him coming back just yet. Back at the guild, Sheila is discussing with an adventurer who asks her if she's heard from Rentt. She tells him she doesn't have any news, and the adventurer tells her to keep him posted. She can see that a lot of adventurers are worried about him because he inspired them. He also inspired her to be a good guild employee, and she remembers when she first met him. Rentt suddenly appears in front of her, and she apologizes for being lost in thought. He hands her a request and tells her he wants to take it up. She sees that he needs to fight off 3 strong orcs, and she tells him she can't recommend the request for an iron rank adventurer. He tells her he has defeated orcs before, and she grants him the request. She tells him not to do anything reckless, and he tells her he understands because he has just one life. He tells her he understands that fact more than anyone else. Lorraine is still contemplating how Rentt would take the promotional exam with his current looks. She suggests he register at the guild under a different name, and Rentt protests, telling her it's against the rules to register twice. She tells him the guild can't confirm he's the same person, and it won't be a big deal if he's eventually found out. She tells him if they find out his true identity, they will want to know how he ended up as an undead. But if he registers as a random traveler looking to become an adventurer, no one would pay attention to his suspicious look. The only downside is that he'll have to start from the lowest adventurer rank since he can't transfer his previous achievements. Rentt tells her he doesn't mind that because his goal is to one day become the highest ranking adventurer. Rentt returns to the guild after completing his first request, and Sheila is shocked by how quickly he completed it. He brings out his magic bag and hands over the orc meat. She commends how well the meat was cut and preserved, telling him the request giver would be pleased. Rentt notices something is amiss, and he asks her what's wrong. She tells him to wait for a moment. She walks away, and some adventurers who overheard Rentt saying he slayed 3 orcs wonder how he was able to do it since he's a low-rank adventurer. Rentt overhears them, and he understands that he completed a request that was beyond his rank. Sheila comes back with a scroll that she hands over to Rentt. She tells him she spoke with the higher up at the guild. She asks him if he would like to participate in the bronze rank ascension exam. The guild usually doesn't allow newly registered adventurers to partake in the exam, but the higher-ups were convinced of Rentt's capabilities. Rentt accepts the offer. Later at night, Lorraine is surprised Rentt was already asked to participate in the bronze rank ascension exam, but she thinks he deserves it given his skills. She asks him what name he used to register at the guild, and he tells her he used Rentt Vivi. Lorraine almost chokes on her tea and asks him why he chose to use Vivi as his last name. She tells him the guild officials are familiar with her family name, and they may get suspicious of him. He tells her he didn't want people to think that a weird man was staying over at her house, so he named himself as a relative. She understands his perspective, but she tells him she doesn't care about her public image. Everyone already thinks of her as a worthless scholar who couldn't make it to Capital. She doesn't care if people look at her weirdly anymore. Rentt tells her she's helped him too much already, and he didn't want to cause her more trouble. On the topic of helping, she tells him he does so many chores in the house that she may end up being indebted to her. Rentt tells her that can never be possible because he only retained his sense of humanity because of her. Lorraine tells him he can be her roommate for eternity without paying rent. She tells him since they're now relatives, he doesn't have to be so reserved around her. Rentt is even more grateful to her now. The next day, Rentt goes into the guild and a guild official asks him who he is. Rentt introduces himself and tells the man he's there for the Ascension exam. The man now recognizes him and Sheila calls out to him, telling him she didn't expect him to come to the guild that day. She thought he would be studying to take part in the next exam since he didn't have time to prepare for it. Rentt tells her the next exam is months away and he can't wait. An adventurer comes late happy to have made it, but Rentt knows he will have some points deducted for being late. A guild official calls the attention of all the Iron rank adventurers. He tells them the Bronze rank Ascension exam is about to begin. The first exam will test the adventurer's knowledge about guild regulations, monster materials, and everything in between. Those who pass the knowledge exam will be allowed to partake in the practical exam. The practical exam always changes with each set of adventurers. Rentt remembers he was asked to pick up some herbs when he first did the exam. The official asks the adventurers to follow him, and Sheila wishes Rentt good luck. The adventurers sit in a room to take the written exam, and Rentt looks around. More adventurers are taking the exam than he expected. He recognizes a girl as one of the duo adventurers he stumbled upon in the labyrinth. He figures out that her partner will be participating in the exam. There aren't many commoners in the town who can write. Rentt was lucky to study writing and herb language back when he was still in his village. He thought that the knowledge would be vital to his dream to become an adventurer. That was why that kind of exam was a piece of cake for him, coupled with the fact that he had previously taken it. After the exam, some adventurers aren't happy with their score. Sheila congratulates Rentt for getting a perfect score because not many people can achieve that. Rentt tells her he's just happy he passed the exam, and he asks her what the practical exam will be. She tells him he'll form a party and perform a guild request. She pairs him with Reyes and Lola, the duo adventurers, and they form a party. Reyes tells him he's a swordsman who fights using spirit to raise his stamina, and he'll be the vanguard. Lola tells him she's a mage who can also use healing arts, so she'll be the support. Rentt tells them he's also a swordsman who uses mana and spirit, and he's glad to be working with them. The guild official comes to address the adventurers, telling them they'll be performing a guild request. He tells them the location is at the labyrinth of the new moon, and he hands them a map. He tells them their objective is to reach the designated point on the map, and they have until sunset to achieve this. One adventurer asks if they'll all be going to the same location, and he tells them they'll complete the same request. He tells them the first party to complete the quest will be rewarded. They all understand it'll be a competition to be the first party to complete the request. They arrive at the labyrinth, and the other adventurers rush inside. Reyes asks Rentt if he's ever been to the labyrinth, and Rentt tells him he has. Reyes tells him he has also been to the labyrinth, and Lola tells him they didn't get very far. Reyes tells her they'll go deeper when they earn their bronze rank. They are about to go inside, but Rentt stops them. He tells them they need to purchase a map, and Lola asks him why they can't use the map from the guild. Rentt tells her the map was printed 15 years ago, and Lola realizes the map could be unreliable. Rentt walks over to a stall, and he tells the vendor he wants to buy a map. The vendor tells him the price, and they're shocked by the amount. Rentt tells him he just needs the map for the first floor, and he makes a good bargain. The vendor agrees to it, and he hands Rentt the map. Reyes wonders if the vendor's map would be accurate, and Rentt asks him to compare it with the one from the guild. They compare them, and they can spot some differences. The new map also shows the location of the traps in the labyrinth, and they are happy they can make their way through the labyrinth without worry. The vendor advises them to follow Rentt closely if they want to pass the exam. Lola wonders why the maps are so different, and Rentt tells him the guild may intentionally mislead them. He tells them to never let their guard down because the exam was designed to test their mettle as adventurers. Reyes isn't too happy about this, and Rentt tells him the guild can be nasty sometimes. They enter the labyrinth, and they're soon intercepted by some skeletons. Rentt tells them not to let up their guard against the skeleton, and Reyes heeds his advice. Lola uses her magic to enhance his skills, and he charges at the skeleton. They defeat them easily, and Rentt is impressed with their capabilities despite their young age. Reyes is having some problems with one skeleton, but Rentt comes to his aid. Lola is worried about the unusual number of monsters they had to face. Rentt thinks something must have attracted them, and he walks up to a pouch on the ground. Reyes wonders how skeletons can be lured, and Rentt shows him the pouch of incense. Reyes takes a sniff of it, wondering why it was in the labyrinth. Rentt tells him he will soon find out because there's an ambush laid for them around the corner. Lola tells him the monster shouldn't be that smart, and Rentt tells her the monsters aren't. He tells her it's other adventurers trying to ambush them. Reyes is scared of fighting other adventurers. Rentt decides to go on first, and he tells them to be prepared to back him up. Rentt walks up to the corner cautiously and swiftly turns around it. An adventurer tries to attack him, but he blocks it. Reyes and Lola run up to him, and Rentt leaves the first adventurer to Reyes since he's the vanguard. He rushes to the other adventurers in the ambush party. The archer of the ambush party tries to bring him down with an arrow, but he dodges it. The archer tries to notch another arrow, but Rentt knocks him down before he can. The mage tries to take Rentt down with a fire spell, but Rentt cuts through it, which scares the daylight out of the mage. Rentt breaks his staff and knocks him out. Reyes is having some trouble with the swordsman, and Lola comes to his aid. She casts a bright light to distract the swordsman, and Reyes uses that opportunity to launch his attack. Rentt can see they're doing well, so he decides to leave them to it. They take down the swordsman with some teamwork, and they capture the adventurers. Lola wonders why fellow participants would ambush them. Reyes tells her they did it because they want them to fail, since the examiner told all adventurers to do whatever they want. Rentt tells them monsters aren't the only harmful thing in the labyrinth. They now understand why adventurers should never let their guard down. Reyes tells Rentt he would follow his lead from then on, and Rentt tells them they have to proceed carefully. After they leave, another adventurer comes out of the shadows, impressed that Rentt was able to predict the ambush. He frees the ambush party, and he tells them Rentt noticed they work for the guild. They wonder who he is, and the shadow adventurer tells them he reminds him of someone else. He thinks his sister's information was accurate. Sheila goes into the guildmaster's office, and he sternly tells her he heard a rumor about Rentt Vivi. She asks him what he heard, and he tells her people think he may be a culprit. He tells her he doesn't have a previous record, and he came out of nowhere, which makes him very suspicious. He tells her to report back to him if she finds out anything about him. Rentt and his party arrive at a door, and Lola figures out that a labyrinth boss is behind the door. Rentt asks Reyes if they've ever fought a boss, and he tells him they have never because 2 iron rank adventurers won't survive it. Suddenly, a party comes up behind them, and they're surprised they didn't get there first. Rentt is relieved that more adventurers have arrived. The leader of the party makes fun of Rentt's party and asks Lola to join their party since she's cute, but Reyes tells them to back off. They're about to pick a fight, but Rentt points his sword at the party leader. The leader tells him he was just joking, and Rentt tells him he doesn't take jokes well. The leader tells Rentt they weren't trying to go in before them, but Rentt tells him they can go in because they want to take a break. They apologize to Rentt, and they go in. They think Rentt is stupid for giving up his spot and letting them go in first. Reyes thinks they'll lose because they let another party in first, but Lola notices that Rentt has a plan. Reyes thinks that Rentt wants them to see what a boss fight is like, and Rentt tells him it's not only that. The rude party cries out in pain, and they run out carrying the injured member. Lola recognizes some of the guild staff, and Rentt tells them they won't be ice-guyed even if they lose the boss fight. Reyes motivates himself to enter the boss's room. Rentt is glad that Reyes was able to strengthen his resolve, and they walk into the boss room. Reyes wonders if Rentt just wanted them to see how a boss fight would go, but Rentt tells him he also wants him to know that he won't lose his life if he loses. Rentt tells him he can turn back from a fight he knows he can't win, but Reyes knows that if he walks away from this fight, he won't be able to ever return. If that happens, Reyes knows he won't ever become a true adventurer, and Lola is moved by his resolve. Rentt can see that he has made his resolve, and they walk into the boss room. They look around the room, watching out for the boss so it doesn't take them by surprise. Suddenly, a huge transparent slime with a crystal at its core rises from the ground before them. They all get ready to battle the Grand Slime, and Reyes is confident they won't lose like the previous party of adventurers. Reyes thinks it would be a good idea to write in their report that they defeated the boss after the first party lost to it. But Rentt thinks they are getting the wrong idea because the request didn't ask them to defeat the boss. It would have been easier for them if the previous party defeated the boss. But Rentt sees it as an opportunity to learn about the hardships of life. Reyes rushes at the Grand Slime, and it's about to attack him by he predicts it and dodges perfectly. Rentt tells him to aim for the slime's core, but as soon as Reyes sinks his sword into the slime, he can't drive it any further. The slime knocks him to the ground, but he gets up and dodges its next series of attacks. Lola is about to help him with her magic, but Rentt tells her to focus on gathering her mana. Rentt is confident that they would be able to take down the Grand Slime with their capabilities if they work together efficiently. Before they entered the room, Rentt told Reyes that physical attacks don't work against the slime. He told him they would have to use magic attacks against it, and he asked Lola if she could cast a strong fire spell. Lola told him she could, but it would take time for her to finish casting it. Rentt told her he would handle the slime's attack while she was casting it, but Reyes told him he'd like to handle that. Reyes is barely holding his own against the slime, so Lola asks Rentt to give him a hand. The slime is about to overwhelm Reyes with its attacks, but Rentt steps on and fends it off. He keeps slicing through the blobs the slime throws at them, and Reyes does the same as well. Lola finally gathers enough mana to cast her spell, and she informs them of this. She casts her fire spell at the slime, and it melts. Lola is happy her spell worked well against it, and Rentt tells Reyes to finish off the slime before it regenerates. Raze cuts through the slime's core, and they're glad they were able to defeat a boss. Rentt brings out a bottle and tells them they need to gather the slime fluid because it can fetch them a handful of money. They begin filling their bottles with the slime fluid, but some adventurers use that opportunity to run past them and head for the finish line. Raze is about to go after them, but Lola tells him to let them go forward. Rentt knew that Lola would notice that there was a trap ahead. A sleeping gas is suddenly released and the adventurers pass out. Rentt expected the trap because people tend to let their guard down just before they reach their goal. Rentt tells them even if the adventurers reach the goal before them, it wouldn't be a problem. Lola figures out that the test isn't about finishing it first. She reminds Raze that the guild master never said the party who finishes first is the one that passed the test. He only said the first party to finish would receive a perk. Everyone misunderstood that as the party who finished first would win the test because they led them to believe that. Raze now realizes he shouldn't have been worried about finishing first all this time. Rentt tells him they just have to complete the test within the time limit, and Raze tells him he would have appreciated the information a lot sooner. Rentt tells him he has to be able to think for himself as a first-rate adventurer. They get to the final destination and open the door to the room. A guild official welcomes them, telling them they are the first ones to reach the destination. They don't trust him, and they demand he shows them proof of his identity as a guild official. He shows them his official letter, and they now believe him. He hands them bronze crests, and he tells them once they present the crests to the receptionist, they would be confirmed as bronze rank adventurers. Raze asks him about the perks the guild master said the first party will get. The official gives them some potions as their gifts for being first, and Raze is so happy to take them. Rentt asks them to escort him through a detour on the way back. They go down a flight of stairs, and Raze thinks they'll get to the second level when they go through the door. Rentt tells him the labyrinth is a place that defies human understanding, and he's about to witness that firsthand. They go through the door and find themselves in a huge serene lush with greenery and a sun overhead. Raze is amazed, and he wonders how the sun is shining underground. Lola heard stories about the scenery of the labyrinth changing with each floor, but she never expected it to be this breathtaking. Rentt tells them this is the kind of world that they would be facing henceforth, and they're both hyped up. Raze wants to explore the forest a bit, but Rentt tells him they have to return to the guild to complete the test, and he's bummed out by this. They make their way back to the guild, and when they get there both Raze and Lola are exhausted because of the traps they had to go through. They now fully understand why Rentt said the guild can be very nasty sometimes. They submit the crests to Sheila at the reception desk, and she confirms the end of their bronze rank ascension exam. Raze asks her if they're now bronze rank adventurers, but she seems skeptical. A guild official gives her a report and tells her she can confirm them as bronze rank adventurers. Raze asks her what is happening, and Rentt tells him the official was watching them the entire time during the exam, but the others didn't realize it. The official tells them an adventurer's personality becomes more apparent during the exam, and they can't promote anyone with an unfit personality. Lola asks him how they did, and Sheila tells her they did well and are now officially bronze rank adventurers. Raze and Lola are overjoyed that they passed. They are glad they left the village against the advice of their parents to become adventurers. Rentt is glad he has achieved his bronze rank once again. They leave the guild, and he thanks Raze and Lola for their assistance. Raze tells him they should be the ones thanking him, and he promises they won't forget the lessons he taught them. He tells Rentt he feels like a proper adventurer for the first time thanks to him. Lola would have loved for them to stay together, but she can tell that Rentt has a different goal. She knows that he taught them different things during the test, so they would be able to fight on their own. They tell him he'll always be their friend, and they hope they'll meet again someday. They get on their carriage and leave the city. Sheila thinks they are nice kids, and Rentt tells her that though he was guiding them, they also helped him realize some things. Sheila tells Rentt she would like to ask him a question, and Rentt realizes that she has figured out his true identity. He asks her if the guild will punish him for what he did, but Sheila tells him she's the one who'll be asking the questions. Rentt tells her he won't show himself at the guild again if they've discovered his secret. He's about to walk away, but Sheila holds him back and tells him she just wants to know what happened to his body. They decide to go somewhere private, and though Rentt wanted to run away, he heard the worry in Sheila's voice, and he knew he had to answer her. They enter a private room, and Rentt tells her he's in some deep trouble, but he doesn't want anyone to intervene, including the guild. She tells him she hasn't informed the guild about him, and he wonders why she's keeping it a secret. She tells him she's not sure he's the same Rentt and she wants to confirm his identity herself. She tells him she told the official who watched them during the exam a little about him, but he's her brother, so she assures him that he won't leak his secret. She asks him to tell her what happened to his body. She knows Rentt won't trust her easily, so she presents him with a magic contract she had made. Whoever signs a magic contract and breaks their oath will incur a penalty enforced by magic. Sheila promises to resign from the guild and register as a slave in a country if she leaks his secret. Rentt tells her she's doing way too much, and he asks her why she's going to such lengths for him. She tells him she just wants to help him because she only got so far because of him. She tells him there are many people indebted to him, though he may not realize it. Rentt decides to sign the contract and explain everything to Sheila. After signing, he wonders how he'll tell her the story, but he decides to just show her to save time. He takes off his hood and tweaks his mask to reveal his eyes. Sheila gets a glimpse of his face and she looks frightened. Rentt sees that his face scares her and he tells her it may be better she doesn't know more about what happened to him. She tells him she doesn't want to remain ignorant about his situation. She asks him how it happened and he tells her he turned into an undead. Sheila tells him that's impossible and he can understand her confusion. Rentt tells her to have a rethink to see if she can actually help him. He tells her he has no intention of hurting anyone, but he knows she can't easily trust him in his current state. He gets up to leave the room, but Sheila stops him. She tells him she believes that he won't attack anyone, even if he's an undead, because he's still the same kind person he's always been. She tells him she will help him because he has helped a lot of people before, including her. She takes his hand and she assures him she'll help him if it's a matter relating to the guild. They both go to Lorraine's house and she's surprised to see Sheila with Rentt. Sheila tells her she has something to discuss with her and Sheila is surprised she's paying her a visit so late. Lorraine asks Rentt if he laid his hands on Sheila, but Sheila tells her he only relayed some information to her. Lorraine invites her into the house and she apologizes that her place is messy. Rentt knows the place isn't messy because he cleaned up before leaving. Lorraine asks Sheila what she knows and she tells her Rentt told her he was turned into a monster, but he doesn't attack people. Lorraine is surprised Sheila still decided to pay her a visit after hearing that. She tells her she's like a young girl going into the house of a witch and a monster, and she shouldn't be surprised if she gets boiled to be used as dinner. Sheila tells her she's nothing but a scholar, but Lorraine tells her she's just using that title as a cover to perpetrate her evil deeds. She tells Sheila she hunts for young girls during the night to help keep her skin smooth. Sheila laughs it off, but Lorraine tells her that is the monster Rentt currently is, and the smile disappears off Sheila's face. Rentt knows that if Sheila says the wrong thing, Lorraine would take her out without hesitation. Sheila tells Lorraine she knows that's what Rentt is, and Lorraine is satisfied with her answer. She tells Sheila she wasn't being mean to her, and they decide to have dinner together. After having dinner, Sheila praises Rentt's cooking skills, and he tells her he learnt it from his hometown. Sheila gives Rentt the payment for all the housework he does, and he takes a drop from the bottle. Sheila realizes that Rentt is a lesser vampire. Lorraine asks about the magic contract, and Rentt tells her the contract entails that Sheila won't reveal his identity. Sheila tells her Rentt has been catching the attention of a lot of people. She tells them there have been many cases of novice adventurers going missing all over the kingdom. Lorraine asks her how they know it wasn't done by monster, and Sheila tells her they don't find the adventurers' belongings. The guild thinks it's a mass kidnapping, and because of Rentt's sudden appearance and suspicious look, they think he's the mastermind behind it. Sheila tells them Rentt is too good to be a novice and other adventurers are spreading rumors about him out of jealousy. Rentt is happy he's good enough to make people jealous, but Lorraine tells him it's nothing to joke about. Sheila tells him he's in a sticky situation and he decides to lay off labyrinth exploration for a while. Sheila asks him to be more specific, and he decides to stay away from labyrinths for about 4 days. Reyes and Lola are at the guild looking for a third adventurer to join their party so they can explore the second floor. The guild master can see that the new adventurers are enthusiastic. He asks Sheila about Rentt Vivi, who participated in the exams, and she tells him he has a suitable personality. He asks her for an update on Rentt Faina because they wanted him to become a guild staff when he retired. A little commotion catches his attention, and he tells Sheila to take care of it. Sheila tells him the new Rentt is also a wonderful adventurer. Lorraine is still in bed, but the sound of Rentt leaving the house wakes her up. She thinks he's off to the labyrinth, but she remembers he can't go to the labyrinth until he's cleared of the kidnapping suspicions. She thinks he should take things easy, but she knows that it's beyond him to do that. Rentt tests out his new sword, and he's impressed with Clope's work. Clope tells him he tuned it to his taste because he knows how he tends to do things. Rentt realizes Clope knows his real identity. Clope tells him to try out the sword's abilities. Rentt decides to test his mana ability, and he easily splits a log of wood. Clope can see that he has gotten a lot better at handling a sword, and his mana is much stronger. Rentt decides to try controlling the sword's strength with his spirit ability. He splits a log of wood by just piercing through it. He decides to test out his divinity ability, and he cuts through the wood logs easily. Rentt is impressed with the sword because it doesn't budge even when he infuses it with divinity. Clope notices that new sprouts are growing from the wood pieces Rentt cut. Rentt figures out that it's the power of divinity. Clope wonders how he can use the power of divinity because a person needs to be blessed by a god to use it. Rentt tells him he repaired a small shrine a long time ago on a whim. Clope is surprised Rentt is religious, but Rentt tells him he didn't even know the god, but he thinks it's a low-ranking god. Clope decides to keep a piece of wood because he thinks it'll contain divinity if he nurtures it. Rentt tells Clope he wants to keep practicing with his sword, and Clope is surprised because he has tested his 3 abilities. Rentt tells him he wants to try using the 3 abilities at once, and Clope provides him with a huge log of wood. Clope asks him if he knows about mana spirit fusion art. Rentt tells him he has heard rumors about it. Clope explains that the technique entails the activation of the mana and spirit abilities to increase power exponentially. Rentt realizes it's a technique only masters can use. Clope tells him that if a person fails to perform it properly, their body will explode. Clope thinks that Rentt is deterred, but Rentt decides to try it out, because he knows he'll survive even if his body explodes. Clope gives Rentt his sword so he doesn't have to use his new sword in case the technique is too powerful for it. He tells Rentt his sword can't use divinity. Rentt takes his sword and he gets ready to try out the technique. He infuses the sword with mana and he assembles spirit on his other hand. Rentt tries to fuse both techniques, but he's having a hard time putting them together. He decides to quickly strike the wood down before he loses control. Clope could see that he had a hard time controlling it, and he wondered if Rentt would still add divinity to the fusion because he thinks it'll be too dangerous. Rentt tells him he'll do it anyway. He does the spirit mana fusion, and he triggers his divinity as well. Rentt realizes he has the power to perform the fusion. He decides to do it so he can achieve his dreams of becoming the highest-ranking adventurer. He uses all his might to infuse his sword with the 3 techniques, and Clope wonders if he's okay because things weren't looking good from his point of view. Rentt keeps trying to infuse the sword with the technique, but Clope notices the sword is about to break, and he warns Rentt. Rentt decides to strike out with the sword, but after the strike, the sword crumbles into dust. The log of wood turns into a ball, and Clope is surprised. Rentt apologizes for destroying his sword, and Clope tells him the divinity technique is too powerful to be used on just any weapon because it can undo the weapon's forging. He tells Rentt he forged his sword to handle a good amount of divinity, but it won't be able to withstand the new technique he's trying to learn. He tells him not to use anything more than the magic fusion art. Rentt remembers the wizard who cursed him, and he wonders what he'll do when he meets an opponent that cannot be defeated with the technique. Clope suggests that he makes more swords for Rentt, but Rentt tells him he doesn't have the money to pay for that. Clope tells Rentt he's aware. Rentt walks down an alley, realizing he'll need good equipment to achieve the highest rank. He decides to start saving for them, but he hears a quarrel somewhere in the alley. A boy asks an adventurer for a request, but the adventurer tells him he can't take a request outside the guild because it'll come back to bite him. The boy begs the adventurer, but the adventurer is getting pissed at the man for begging so much. Rentt steps in, and the adventurer wonders who he is. Rentt tells the adventurer he'll take care of the boy's request. They're surprised, but Rentt offers the adventurer a bride, and he leaves. The boy is scared to be left alone with Rentt. Rentt tells him he's an adventurer, and he wants to hear his request. The boy is surprised, but he tells Rentt to exterminate the master of the lake. Rentt is surprised by the title given to a monster. They head out on a carriage, and Rentt doesn't like the request or the reward. The boy introduced himself to Rentt as Runtus, and he told Rentt he came from a village called Todd's. Rentt knows about the village and its unique festival. Runtus told Rentt they had a tradition to offer beautiful maidens capable of using mana to the master of the lake so that it would keep the village safe, according to legend. He told Rentt they still performed the festival once a year to honor the legend, But during the festival, the master of the lake ate the maiden. Both Lorraine and Rentt were surprised by this. Ryu told them that the master of the lake began demanding sacrifices more frequently, and the village maidens were used as its victims. Ryuntis begs Rentt to help him because his little sister is the next victim. Rentt realizes that Ryuntis's request isn't to defeat the master of the lake, but to save his sister. He thinks that he may not have to fight, but he still feels like something is amiss. They arrive at the village and Rentt notices that the place is quiet. Ryuntis tells him the village used to be more lively, but the chaos brought by the master of the lake took the villagers' energy. Rentt looks around to see people hiding in their houses. Ryuntis calls out to him, and he walks over to see a door with a mark on it. He asks Ryuntis about the mark, and Ryuntis tells him the house with that mark must offer their girl to the master of the lake. Rentt asks him if the master of the lake made the mark, but Ryuntis tells him the master of the lake lives in the lake, and nobody has seen its true form. He tells Rentt the mark was made by the Kelpies. Rentt tells him Kelpies are really strong monsters, which surprises Ryuntis. Ryuntis's sister Amaris opens the door, and he introduces Rentt to her. He tells her Rentt will save her, but she drags him into the house and locks the door. She scolds him for being deceived by a suspicious person from the city. Ryuntis tries to explain to her that Rentt is a nice person, but she doesn't believe him. She tells him Rentt looks very suspicious. Rentt could hear their conversation because he's now a monster, and he thinks Amaris is very mean. Amaris opens the door and thanks him for listening to her brother. She tells him the festival is a tradition the village has engaged in for ages, and she can't be selfish now that it's her turn. She tells Rentt to forget everything Ryuntis told him and return home. Rentt tells her only Ryuntis has the right to cancel his request. Ryuntis is happy about this, but Amaris tries to goad him into canceling the request. He tells her he would never cancel it. Amaris tells Rentt he can stay in their house if he wants to stay in the village, but warns him not to interfere with the festival. She tells him she wants to fulfill her role as a sacrifice. Later, Ryuntis apologizes for his sister's hard-headedness. Rentt knows the festival is the next day, and he tells Ryuntis she won't listen if they tell her to run away. Rentt wonders what Ryuntis wants to do, and Ryuntis begs him to do everything he can to save his sister. The next day, Rentt is on his way back from the lake when he comes up on some traveling merchants. One of the merchants gives some kids freebies in exchange for getting their parents to buy something from them because business hasn't been good. The children agree and they take the freebies, but as they turn to leave, they look up to see Rentt. Rentt wants to ask them for a favor, but they run away because they're scared of him. The merchant notices he hasn't seen Rentt in the village before. He asks him if he's there for the festival, and Rentt tells him that's what he's in the village for. The merchant tells Rentt he can't at a bad time because the master of the lake has been angered. He tells Rentt that's why the villagers aren't too keen about buying things. Ryuntis informs him that lunch is ready, and Rentt tells him he'll join them soon. He apologizes to the merchant for hindering his business, and the merchant tells him it's better he avoids the festival and leaves the village. He wonders if the merchants visit the village often, and Ryuntis tells him they do. Later that day, Amaris is about to be offered as a sacrifice, and the woman grooming her tells her they thought of taking her and running away. Ryuntis convinced them the festival should have been stopped a long time ago, but Amaris knows this will anger the master. The woman knows that Ryuntis was thinking about the future of the village. This brings Amaris to tears. After everyone leaves, Rentt comes to talk to her, but she tells him not to enter her tent because she's not allowed to make contact with others unnecessarily. Rentt decides to talk to her from outside. He tells her he'll do something about it, and he tells her he wants her to fight back. She tells him she can't fight back because humans can't fight against monsters. Rentt tells her he will fight the master alongside Ryuntis, and he tells her not to do anything to make him sad because he's her only family. He then leaves and she silently thanks him. The villagers begin the rituals for the festival. The elder recites the festival rites, and they offer Amaris and an orb as sacrifices to the master. He apologizes to Amaris, and she tells him she understands it's for the benefit of the village. She walks down the pier where she joins Ryuntis and Rentt. They all get in a boat and row out into the lake. A mist suddenly covers the lake, and Rentt thinks it's a bit too convenient. Ryuntis thinks they should head back because visibility is so low, but the orb starts glowing. Rentt tells them the master is appearing, and a giant kraken suddenly appears. Amaris offers the orb to the kraken, and she pleads with it to have mercy on the village. Rentt stops her because it's pointless. He knocks the orb out of her hands into the water, and he tells them to hold on tight to the boat. Rentt steps out of the boat onto the lake, and they're surprised he can walk on it. Rentt draws his sword, ready to unveil the identity of the monster. Fireballs shoot out of the kraken, but Rentt knows krakens can only be found in the sea and they don't shoot fireballs. He rushes at it, but he passes through the kraken and he lands on the other side where a huge boat is docked. Rentt realizes that the mages on the boat put up the illusions and shot the fireballs. The merchant tells Rentt he was better off leaving the village, and Rentt tells him he didn't expect the master of the lake to look so ugly. The other merchants try to attack him, but he blocks their attacks and deals with them. Rentt and Amarys row through the mist calling out to Rentt, and he answers them. They're surprised to see the merchant boat. The next day, Amarys tells the village chief what happened. Amarys wonders how Rentt knew, and he tells her master of an area don't just go on a rampage unprovoked. The elder wonders what happened to the other girls, and the merchant tells him they were planning to sell them in another kingdom for a high price. The elder is glad they are alive. The merchant tells them the location of the maidens, and the elder orders the villagers to get them. Rentt tells Rentt he considers his request fulfilled by Amarys doesn't look happy about this. Rentt is about to leave, and they try to convince him to stay for the festival, but he tells them someone is waiting for him back home. They bid him farewell, and he accepts their thanks. Rentt gets on his carriage, and he's disappointed because the merchants weren't behind the missing adventurers since they only kidnap girls. He returns home and tells Lorraine the story, and she's glad the girls are safe. Rentt is thankful for her gift that lets him walk on water. Lorraine is sad she didn't get to meet the master of the lake. Lorraine tells him Amarys will always remember him, but Rentt thinks she'll forget because that's the life of an adventurer. Rentt walks into the guild and looks through the requests on the board. The rewards aren't appealing, but Rentt knows adventurers aren't in the profession for money. Adventurers complete requests to help people whose requests typically won't be accepted through the guild. Sheila wonders if Rentt is interested in any of the requests, but he tells her he's keeping his promise of not visiting labyrinths anytime soon. Sheila wanted to help him find a request he can complete easily, and he wonders if anybody has taken up the bronze coin request. Sheila tells him the task is a pretty difficult one, and he realizes the task is to gather dragon blood blossoms. It is a plant that grows near a poisonous swamp with a legend behind its origins. A dragon fell in love with a human girl, and its blood turned into a crimson flower, which earned the plant its name. Rentt doesn't like the lore of the story, but Sheila tells him there are rumors that girls will eternally love whoever presents them with the flower. Rentt wonders if the plant can be used as medicine, and Sheila tells him the client plans to use it for its medicine. The children in an orphanage were the ones who put up the request, and they said they need to plant to save someone important to them. Rentt decides to take up the request, to the surprise of Sheila. Rentt arrives at the orphanage, and he didn't expect the place to be as run down as it is. He tries to use the door knocker, but it comes off the door. He decides to try and glue it back to the door using some slime fluid. He considers using the knockers again, but he decides to knock with his knuckles. A little girl answers the door, and she mistakes him for a debt collector. She tells him their chairman Lillian is currently absent from the orphanage. She tells Rentt he'll have to come back another day, but she can't finish her sentence because she looks up at Rentt's face. Rentt tells her he's an adventurer that took up their request from the guild. The girl apologizes for her misconception and ushers him into the orphanage. He enters the orphanage, and the children wonder who he is. The girl introduces him to everyone as an adventurer, and they all rush to greet him. They ask him different questions, but the girl reminds them not to approach adventurers without caution because they are dangerous. They apologize to her for their behavior. She tells Rentt she wasn't referring to him as a dangerous adventurer, but he's glad she's cautious of adventurers. He tells her there are unsavory adventurers out there, and she's right to be cautious of them. He tells the children not to approach any suspicious-looking adventurer, and they take his advice to heart. He's glad they are very honest, which shows how happy they are to be at the orphanage. The girl tells him Lillian is a wonderful person who's very nice to them. Rentt tells her she doesn't have to be polite to him because he doesn't mind. The girl wonders if he'll get angry at her later, but he promises not to. He introduces himself as a bronze rank adventurer, and the girl is surprised because she thought only an iron rank adventurer would accept their request. Rentt realizes she knows a lot about adventurers, and he wonders if she's the one who put up the request. She tells him she put it up, and she introduces herself to him as Elias. Rentt decides to talk to her about the request. He tells her the plant can't be gotten easily. Elias tells him she knows that because the plant is rarely in shops, and even if she finds it in a shop, it's usually very pricey. Rentt can see she really needs the plant and he asks her for details. She tells him she needs him to play along, but he doesn't understand what she wants. She takes him into Lillian's room and Lillian apologizes for how messy her room is. She tells him she's the administrator of the orphanage and she introduces herself as the priestess of the Church of the Eastern Sky. Rentt introduces himself to her and she apologizes for the meager reward on the request. She thanks him for taking up the job to clean the cellar since she can't get the children to do it because monsters spawn in the cellar. She gets into a coughing fit and Elias tells her to get some rest while she fills Rentt in on the rest of the details. They leave the room and Elias tells Rentt Lillian's illness is called accumulated malice disease. She tells him Lillian is a divinity user, but because she isn't strong enough, every time she uses her powers, it causes harm to her body. Rentt didn't know such a condition existed. Elias tells him a healer looked at Lillian and told her she would need a saint's purification or a special medicine to get cured. Rentt now understands that they need the dragon blood blossom to make the medicine. Rentt realizes that Lillian doesn't know about her illness, and Elias tells him if she knew, she would have another priest take over her position. Rentt realizes if that happened, Lillian would accept her fate with her illness, and he decides to help Elias get the plant before that happens. Elias thought that no one would accept the request, so she thought of becoming an adventurer and trying to get the plant herself. Rentt is surprised by this. She tells him she's adept with mana abilities, but he can see she doesn't have time to train. Rentt promises to obtain the flower and she thanks him, but he decides to clean out the cellar first. He walks into the cellar and Elias follows him. He tells her she doesn't have to follow him, but she wants to watch him take out monsters. He decides to give her a dagger so she can protect herself. Rentt tells her there are monsters in the cellar and she's surprised by this. The monster rats are larger than their usual size. Rentt uses his divinity ability and the leader of the rats orders the rest of the rats to run away. He rushes at Rentt, but Rentt swats him away. He rushes once again, but this time he bites Rentt's arm. Rentt peels him off his arm and throws him on the ground. The rat suddenly comes under a spell and its color changes. Rentt realizes the rat is now under his control and he orders it around, which surprised Elias. Rentt takes the rat back with him and Lorraine is surprised to see a rat sitting on his shoulder. He tells her the rat is now his ally and Lorraine realizes Rentt has the ability to create manipulative servants just like a vampire. Lorraine previously didn't think about giving his blood to living creatures to test this theory. Rentt decides to keep the rat and Lorraine decides to take specimens from the rat as payment for its rent. She decides to test it and do some observation. She wonders what the rat would eat, but it immediately puts its mouth on her finger and she realizes it craves her human juice just like Rentt. Rentt decides to name the rat Black, but Lorraine decides to name it Edel, and the rat agrees with her. Lorraine wonders if Rentt can communicate with it, but he tells her he can only feel its emotions. At night, Rentt is restless because he can't sleep. He thought of wandering a labyrinth non-stop, but he knew an adventurer who doesn't rest would draw the suspicions of the guild. Lorraine comes into the room and offers him some food since he'll leave early the next day. Rentt is surprised by Lorraine cooking, but she scolds him for thinking so little of her. She warns him that swamp is dangerous and Rentt is surprised she knows where he'll be going. She asks him if he'll go there alone and he tells her he has to because the poison won't affect him. She reminds him that he'll need a party to defeat a dragon subspecies living in the swamp. He tells her he's not planning to fight it and he shows her holy water he bought from a stall. Lorraine remembers there are rumors that holy water stops the monster from approaching someone, but she tells him it's not a guarantee. Rentt tells her he would figure something out if it doesn't work. Rentt decides to dig into the meal and he's surprised by how good it tastes in his mouth. It has been a while since he was able to savor the taste of food and Lorraine tells him she put a drop of her human juice in the food. She promises to make more for him when he gets back. Rentt takes a carriage out to the swamp and the driver informs him of their arrival. Rentt comes down from the carriage and the driver tells him he'll come back to pick him up later in the day. Rentt walks into the swamp and he wonders if Edel can handle the poison. He knows he'll be able to use his divinity to purify Edel if he's affected by poison, so he decides not to worry about it. Rentt follows the path put by other adventurers who didn't want to take a step into the swamp since it's full of poison. Suddenly, several goblins notch arrows and fire at Rentt, but he blocks them. Rentt knows that monsters in the wild are much stronger than those in the labyrinth. These wild monsters tend to attack in packs and have knowledge about weapons, but Rentt is much stronger and he's convinced he can take them down. He rushes at them and takes down a group with one single swipe of his sword. He takes down the other group with another swipe to defeat all the goblins. Rentt walks further into the swamp, and he's happy to be an undead because he's resistant to poison. He thinks he would not mind living as an undead for the rest of his life if he can bear with his new appearance. The wooden path suddenly breaks and Rentt falls into the poisonous swamp. A swamp shark uses that opportunity to rush at him, and he fights them off while Edel spectates while relaxing. Rentt defeats the sharks, and he decides to keep his guard up from then on. Rentt picks up Edel, disappointed in him for being so nonchalant. Sheila thanks Lorraine for the food because it was delicious, and Lorraine tells her Rentt said the same thing. Sheila is surprised Rentt is eating normal food since he's an undead, but Lorraine tells her she mixed her human juice with his meal. Lorraine was surprised the guild caught up to what happened at Todd's village. Sheila tells her the villagers were grateful to the adventurer who helped them, but they refused to divulge his name to the guild. Lorraine realizes she came to ask Rentt directly if he was the one who helped the village. Lorraine tells her he won't reveal the truth because being involved in a kidnapping situation would make him more suspicious. Sheila is surprised by how much Lorraine knows about Rentt, and she tells her she's known Rentt for a long time. Sheila wonders why Rentt wants to become the highest-ranking adventurer, but even Lorraine doesn't know his reason. Lorraine tells Sheila she has never asked him about it because adventurers don't like people prying into their past. She didn't want to force an answer out of him. Sheila asks Lorraine if she isn't worried about the monsters he'll face in the swamp. She tells Sheila she's not worried because the guild gives out requests according to the adventurer's capabilities. Sheila tells her she only assigned the request to Rentt because she knew he would be able to complete it. Lorraine tells her she believes in her judgment, and she's convinced Rentt would be able to find a way out if he got into trouble. Rentt is being pursued by the dragons of the swamp, and he regrets buying cheap holy water. He gets to a dead end, and he decides to take the monster head-on. He jumps off a tree to attack the monster, but it shoots out poison. Rentt cuts through the poison, and he strikes at the monster with his mana-infused sword. Though poison doesn't work on him, Rentt isn't convinced he can defeat the monster with just his mana. He decides to use the mana spirit fusion technique, but it doesn't work on the monster. Edel rushes at the monster, and he uses divinity, and Rentt is shocked that Edel can use his divinity powers. The monster eats up Edel, and Rentt is about to save him, but the monster starts choking, and he spits out Edel. Rentt catches Edel, and he's glad Edel gave him an idea of how to defeat the monster. He infuses his sword with divinity and rushes at the monster. The monster spits more poison globs at him, but he dodges them all. He strikes the monster with his sword, and he defeats it easily. He realizes that the monster's weakness is divinity. Since he can't dress the monster because it's so huge, he decides to store it in his magic pouch. Rentt was sure he'll have to fight the monster because he has such bad luck, but he's grateful Edel showed him how to defeat the monster. He decides to come back eventually to get rare materials from the swamp. He arrives at a huge cluster of the dragon blood blossom plants, and he can see their power purifies the air around them. He decides to take more than he initially came for, but a man approaches him behind. The man is surprised to see someone else in the swamp. A strange man approaches Rentt, making him cautious. Rentt wonders what a human is doing alone in the swamp, and the man tells him he has a magic tool that nullifies the poison from the swamp. The man also shows Rentt some holy water to repel the monster, and an accurate map to navigate the swamp. He tells Rentt he's there for the dragon blood blossom, and he asks for his permission to gather them. Rentt lets him by, and the man proceeds to gather the plant. The man gathers some plants, and Rentt wonders if it'll be enough. The man tells Rentt his mistress wants him to gather the plants so she can turn them into medicine since they don't last long in their plant state. Rentt wonders if his mistress is sick, and he tells Rentt his mistress is a bit sick. Rentt wishes her a speedy recovery, and the man is thankful to be acquainted with Rentt. They had always been looking for someone who could procure the plants for them in place of the man. The man wonders if Rentt is an adventurer, and Rentt introduces himself as a bronze rank adventurer. The man is sure Rentt would be suitable for the request because of his rank. He tells Rentt that if he accepts the terms of his request, he would be quite grateful. The man tells Rentt he will draft the request once he returns, and he introduces himself as Isaac Hart. He tells Rentt his mistress's identity would be made to him through the official request he'll submit at the guild. Rentt returns to his carriage, and the driver is impressed that he came out of the swamp unscathed. The man thinks Rentt must be a very skilled adventurer, and Rentt confesses that he uses his mask to hide his identity because he's a Mythril rank adventurer. The driver offers to give him discounts on his next trip out of the castle. Rentt returns to the guild, and Sheila welcomes him back. He hands over his magic bag to her and asks for her help with dissection. Sheila figures out that he defeated the monster, and she's so surprised. Rentt tells her to be quiet so she doesn't attract other adventurers' attention. He tells her there's a lot of work to be done, and she leads him to the guild's dissection area. As they make their way over, Rentt tells Sheila that monsters drop materials other than magic crystals when they are defeated. Rentt tells her he learned how to dissect from hunters in his village, but he sometimes paid experts to help him with the ones he couldn't dissect. They arrive at the dissection area, and the caretaker of the place, named Dario, is about to close up the place. Sheila introduces Rentt to him, and she tells him Rentt has something rare to dissect. She tells him Rentt defeated a Tarrasque, and Dario opens up the place again. The man prepares the place, and he tells Rentt to release the Tarrasque from the magic bag. Rentt releases it, and Dario can see the monster is a huge one. He's impressed it's still in such good condition since people usually weaken the monster with projectiles which damage its shell. Dario figures out that Rentt took it out with a single strike, and Rentt confesses he didn't have the opportunity for multiple attacks. Rentt wonders if it'll fetch a good price, and Dario assures him it'll fetch a heavy price. Rentt decides to leave Dario to do the dissection, and they leave the dissection area. Rentt can see it's late, and he decides to go to the orphanage the next day. He apologizes for taking so long to complete the quest, and Sheila tells him it's all good. She's impressed with how much stronger he has gotten since he defeated a Tarrasque easily. She tells him he's good enough to be a silver rank adventurer, and she advises him not to sell himself short. Rentt knows that he has gotten stronger, but he knows it's not because his skills increased. He thinks he got stronger because he's exploiting his undead body. Though Rentt knows he only became stronger after he turned into a monster, he knows things will go back to being the way they once were if he goes back to being a human. He remembers when he was a human, and he could only make progress by pure effort alone. He wonders if he'll be able to achieve the highest adventurer rank if he goes back to being human. The next day, Rentt returns to the orphanage, and he's about to use the door knocker, but it breaks off again. He quickly repairs it, and Elias suddenly appears behind it, wondering why he's around. He tells her he has completed the request, and she's shocked he completed it so fast. A herbalist looks at the plant, and he's so surprised by how pretty the plant is. He commends Rentt for handling the plant so carefully because he hasn't seen one in such good condition. Rentt tells him the adventurers who go to the swamp to harvest the plant are high-ranking adventurers, and they should know how to handle the plant. An herbalist tells him the adventurers can't afford to take their time gathering the plant in such a dangerous place, and they may also get attacked by monsters on their way back, which can ruin the plant. The healer tells Rentt he will be able to heal Vivian once the herbalist makes the medicine. The herbalist is sure he would be able to make the medicine since the plant is in such a good condition. The herbalist begs to use the leftovers for other people who may need them, and Elias permits him. Rentt wonders if they'll want some more, and they tell him they'll be grateful to get some more. Rentt presents them with a magic bag containing more of the plant. He tells them not to bother paying him, but to use the medicine to help people. The healer tells him he can make a fortune from selling the medicine, but Rentt tells him he just wants to help people. The herbalist thanks him because the lives of so many people will be saved by his kind gesture. Since they don't have anything to repay him, the healer tells Rentt to come to them if he ever needs anything in the future. Meanwhile, Edel goes back to assume command of his subordinates in the cellar, and he gives them some orders. Elias signs on the request to show it has been completed, and Rentt thanks her for it. She tells Rentt she should be the one to thank him, and she tells him she can't thank him enough. She had made up her mind to become an adventurer and get the plant herself if no adventurer took up the request. She tells him it would have been impossible for her to get it, and Rentt wonders if she would still like to become an adventurer. She tells him she wants to become an adventurer now more than ever because he has inspired her. She wants to become an adventurer like him who works to make people happy. She hopes she'll be able to repay him someday, but she doesn't think he'll ever need help. He tells her he could need help someday and that he would be counting on her when he does. She promises to help him if he ever needs her help. Edel returns to give Rentt his report, and Rentt tells Elias that Edel's henchmen will protect the cellar from the little monsters that usually appear there. Elias thanks Edel for his help. She wonders if she'll also be able to tame monsters like that when she becomes an adventurer. Rentt suggests she starts training early if she wants to become an adventurer. He tells her about the guild's training courses, and he offers to teach her when he has some free time. He tells her to learn magic as well since she has mana. She tells him she doesn't have any money to pay for the courses to teach her magic and sword training. Rentt tells her he has an acquaintance that can teach her for free, but she tells him she can't accept his offer because he'll be spoiling her too much. Rentt tells her to pay him back without any interest when she eventually becomes an adventurer. Elias agrees to the deal if she gets to pay it back with interest, and they shake on it. Rentt returns to Lorraine's house, and he tells her about the deal. She tells him she can teach magic, but she's pissed because he said she always has free time, which makes her look jobless. Rentt apologizes to her, and she tells him to choose his words better next time so he doesn't hurt her feelings. Rentt tells her hardly meets with young ladies, so he can't understand their feelings. Lorraine tries to tell him she's a young lady, but doesn't see her as a young lady. She's so pissed, she remembers a curse she has been working on to hurt Rentt. She decided to test the limit of his immortality, and Rentt became scared. Rentt confesses that she's a young lady in his eyes, and he showers her with so many compliments to calm her down. Lorraine wonders where he got his sweet tongue from, and she thinks he flirts with every woman he meets. Rentt denies the allegations, and he tells her he was just saying things that came to his mind. This makes Lorraine blush, and she offers him seconds. She quickly runs into her room to hide her embarrassment. The next day, Rentt wakes up early and heads for the guild, while Adel is still sleeping. He wonders why he's working, and his servant gets to rest. He arrives at the guild to meet Sheila on duty, and she wants to have a word with him. She takes him aside and wonders if he's acquainted with the Latto family. Rentt tells her he has never heard about them, and she's surprised because they received a request personally for him. She hands him the letter, and he realizes it's a request from Isaac, and Sheila thinks he knows the family. Rentt tells her the person he knows is probably the servant of the family, and he wonders if the family is famous. Rentt can't believe he doesn't know about a famous family since he knows almost everything about the city. Sheila tells him she doesn't know much about the family either. She knows they have existed for a long time and has been involved in the workings of magic. That was all she was told as a guild staff, and Rentt realizes the family is very secretive. She tells Rentt that every generation of guild masters has always been instructed to respect the family. She tells Rentt he can't refuse a request from the family if he wants to keep living in the city, and Rentt tells her he wasn't going to refuse it. She wonders if he'll be alright since he's now an undead, and Rentt tells her he knows he'll be in danger if they find out. Sheila thinks everything is so complicated, but Rentt tells her Isaac wasn't suspicious of his appearance when they met. He tells her they wouldn't have sent him a request personally if they had problems with him. Sheila tells him to reach out to her if anything bad happens, and Rentt decides to visit the Latto family house. Meanwhile, the healer and the herbalist pay a visit to Lillian in the orphanage. They inform her that she's inflicted with accumulated malice disease. She tells them she always had her suspicions. She decides to inform the church so they can get a new priest to take over her role. But the herbalist tells her there's no need for that. He hands her the medicine he made for the plant, and she's surprised. He gives her the dosage to make the malice building up inside her disperse slowly over time. Lillian tells them they can't afford the medicine, but Elias tells her she doesn't have to worry about the money because it has been paid for. She begs her to get better soon. Lillian wonders if the healer was the one who went to get the plant, but he tells her though he's a former adventurer, he couldn't achieve that with his skills. The herbalist tells her a bronze rank adventurer took up a request that Elias put up to get the plant. Lillian realizes it was Rentt who got the plant. Rentt arrives at the family home, and he asks a guard at the gate if Isaac is around. The guard tells him Isaac is in a mansion inside the compound, and he welcomes him in. Rentt sees the path leading to the mansion as a maze, and the guard tells him to be careful. Rentt tells him he's there to honor the family's request, and he wonders why he has to pass through the maze. He asks the guard if he needs to pay for the map, but the guard tells him there's no map because the maze garden has a magic tool that can make its pattern change. Rentt is impressed by the power of such a magic tool, and the guard tells him the family has had a hobby of collecting magic tools for generations. He tells him the maze was probably created by one of such magic tools. Rentt realizes he has no choice but to pass through the maze. The guard tells him there's a reward for going through the maze. He tells him he'll be rewarded with a magic tool from the family head if he's able to go through the maze. He tells Rentt the entrance to the maze is only opened if the family head gives his approval, and he's sure Rentt would be rewarded. Rentt thanks him for the information, and he asks him for advice since he's passed the maze before. The guard tells him his only advice is not to rely on the sun. Rentt thanks him and walks into the maze. He couldn't pass on an opportunity to get a magic tool. He's sure he'll get enough money to achieve the highest adventurer rank if he gets a valuable magic tool. He keeps walking through the maze and tries to open his map, which shows where he's been through. But the map doesn't show anything because it doesn't consider the garden as a maze. Rentt keeps moving since he's confident in his sense of direction, but he soon realizes he's completely lost. Sheila tells Rentt he can't refuse a request from the Labyrinth family, and he tells her he wants planning to. She wonders if he'll be fine since he's now an undead, but Rentt assures her that Isaac didn't have any suspicions regarding his appearance when they met. He's convinced they wouldn't have asked him for a request if they had a problem, but Sheila tells him to call on her if something happens. He assures her he will, and he heads over to the Labyrinth family house. He walks through the maze leading to the main house, and he is astounded by how confusing it is. He keeps moving through it confident that he's good with directions. He remembers the guard's advice telling him not to rely on the sun, and he knows adventurers don't usually see the sky in a proper maze. He knows an adventurer should be able to map a maze in their head without the help of the sun. He knows he should have cleared the maze already if the map in his head was correct. He finally arrives at an end of the maze, but it doesn't look like the exit, but a little garden in the middle of the maze. A lady sitting in the garden asks if he wants to give up, but he tells her he's going to try a bit more. She points him in the direction to take, and she warns him that he still has a long way to go. She welcomes him to have some tea with her for a bit if he wants to take a break. Rentt decides to take up her offer, and he figures out that she's part of the Labyrinth family. She pours him some tea, and Rentt realizes that the teapot and the pitcher are both magical tools. He asks her about the tree leaves she's supposed to use, but the lady tells him the teapot can recreate any tea it had poured before even without the leaves. Rentt wonders where she got such an amazing magical tool, and she tells him it was found in a labyrinth over 300 years ago. She tells him it's worth over 300 platinum coins, and Rentt is so surprised because just one platinum coin is enough to live a lavish life. He can't believe the family has a single magic tool worth 300 platinum coins. He realizes the Labyrinth family is on a whole different level compared to other nobles. The lady tells him the teapot is only worth that much because it can only be found by adventurers risking their lives in labyrinths. Rentt tells her some adventurers still find junk in labyrinths despite risking their lives to get it. As he's about to take a sip of tea, his mask reveals the lower part of his face, and the lady notices this. He takes a sip of the tea, and he tells the lady it's delicious. She appreciates his comment, and she tells him she recreated the most delicious tea she once had sometime in the past. He tells her he's never had anything so delicious, and he proceeds to take another sip. The lady asks him if his mask is a magic tool, and he tells her it is. She is curious about where he found the mask, and he tells her an acquaintance of his bought it in Malt. The lady is amazed that such an interesting thing can be found in Malt, and she asks him if he can hand the mask over to her. Rentt knows about her family's occupation of collecting magic tools, and he wonders if she's also into that. The lady apologizes because she thinks the mask is very important to him since he's hesitant. She offers to pay him handsomely for the mask, and Rentt immediately thinks about selling it if only he could get it off his face. But he remembers he is only able to hide his face thanks to the mask, and he tells her he can't sell it to her. The lady realizes he has a deep attachment to the mask, and she apologizes for asking him. Rentt finishes off his tea, and he thanks her for the treat. He gets up to leave, and she bids him farewell. She decides to give him a hint which surprises him. She tells him it's better not to see the sun, and Rentt is surprised. He's hearing something about the sun again. He tells her he'll remember her hint, and he leaves the place as the lady smiles secretly. Rentt keeps walking through the maze, and he looks up at the sun. Suddenly, the sun disappears, and Rentt looks around wondering what happened. He throws a pebble upwards, and it teleports. He wonders if he'll be able to go back, but he realizes some teleportations are one way. Rentt is frustrated that he has to deal with teleportation even when he's not in a real labyrinth. He can't believe he has to start traversing the maze from the beginning. He keeps walking through the labyrinth, and he finally arrives at the end of the maze later in the day. The garden lady welcomes him and congratulates him for figuring out the maze secret. He tells her it was thanks to her advice. The lady introduces herself as Laura, the head of the Labyrinth family. Isaac is also out waiting to welcome him. Rentt is surprised she is the head of the family. He tells them he's an adventurer named Rentt Vivi, and he came to ask about their request. He asks her if she'll also reward him for clearing the maze, and she tells him she will reward him because not many people have managed to clear the maze. She takes him inside, and she tells him he can choose any magic tool he likes from their household. He wonders if she can give him the magic tool that created the maze, but she tells him she can't give it out. He quickly tells her it was a joke as payback for making him suffer through the maze. Laura finds him interesting as Isaac leads them through a door. They go down a flight of stairs with several self-lighting lanterns, and Laura tells him that man-made magic tools are more stable in their performance. Laura tells him the magic tools are just simple constructs, but Rentt thinks magic tools are full of mysteries. They enter a hallway and Laura signals the lights to come on. Rentt is impressed with the quality and number of magic tools the family has. Laura tells him they went through great pain to sort out the magic tools. She wonders why labyrinths spawn all over the world, and she tells Rentt no one has ever found the answer. She tells him no one also knows why magic tools exist, since they are just junk with unclear purposes. She throws a ball on the ground that keeps bouncing endlessly, and Rentt wonders what use the magic tool will be. Rentt asks her why she collected such a magic tool, and she tells him she wanted it because she's a collector. Rentt asks her about a warship hanging on a stand, and she tells him about the warships from the west. She tells him the warship was modeled after those ships which run on stream and can carry people on board. She tells him it runs on mana, and she gives him the controller. Rentt starts behaving like a 5-year-old as he controls the ship, and Laura wonders if he's having fun. He tells her he may even want the ship, and she wonders if that's his final choice. Rentt realizes it's just a toy, and he would need something more useful, but Laura tells him to focus his mana on the warship. He does so, and his consciousness suddenly transfers to it, which amazes him. Rentt tells her the mana consumption is too harsh. She tells him the warship was found in a labyrinth, and the warships if the West was modeled after it, but they used a different source to make it work since they couldn't use mana. Rentt thinks the warship can be good for scouting, but he realizes he can't fly it far because of his mana limit. Rentt decides to keep looking, and as they move through the hallway of magic tools, one tool lights up that catches Rentt's eye. Laura tells him the tool lights up whenever something approaches, and Rentt thinks it's both a useful tool and an inconvenient one. He picks up a picture frame that looks normal, and Laura tells him to press the button on the frame. He presses the button, and the images on the picture come alive, which makes Rentt drop it. Rentt touches a magic tool by accident that absorbs his mana and begins to glow. Laura tells him to be careful as the surroundings begin to tremble. She beacons on Isaac, and she asks him about the deactivation device for the magic tool, and Isaac tells her they stored it in a separate place for safety. A huge hand shoots out from among the magic tools, and several body parts join up with a hand to form a huge body armor. Rentt can't believe his eyes, and he unsheathes his sword, ready to face the armor golem. The golem forms fully, and Rentt wonders why there's a golem in the magic tool hallway. The golem attacks Rentt, but he dodges out of the way on time. He realizes one of the golem's punches can take him out. Isaac searches for the deactivation device, and Laura urges him to hurry up. Rentt tells them they should organize their magic tool, but the golem fires a beam which makes him wonder how long the golem is going to remain active since it only absorbed small mana from him. Laura tells him the golem only needs the mana to activate, but it absorbs mana from the surroundings to get stronger. The golem fires another beam at Rentt, but he dodges again. He has had enough with the golem, and he asks Laura if he can damage the golem. She gives him the go-ahead, but she tells him he can't win against the golem. Rentt tells her he wasn't planning to win against it. The golem tries to stomp him, but he gets out of the way, which makes the golem strike out at him. Rentt uses this opportunity to cut off its arm, and he lunges at the golem's head. He remembers when Lorraine told him about the magic word truth, which is written on a golem's head. She told him to just add one character to the word, and it would change to death, which would cause the golem to self-destruct. Rentt looks at the golem's head, and he can't see anything written in it. The golem grabs him and slams him into the ground. Lorraine was only talking about the primitive golems, and she told him they should have an external deactivation device. Rentt wondered what to do if the device wasn't accessible, and she told him to either run or defeat it. Rentt asks Isaac if he still hasn't found the deactivation device, but Izaker can't find it anywhere on the shelf. Rentt realizes he has no choice but to defeat the golem. He has to use his magic spirit fusion technique, though he would have preferred if he didn't show his secret technique to anyone. The monster lunges at him, but Laura stops the golem with a single word, and Rentt thinks it was deactivated just in time. Isaac apologizes for putting him in danger because of their negligence, but Rentt tells them it was caused by his carelessness. He hopes they won't charge him for the damages, and Laura tells him their servants will clean it up. Laura wonders if Rentt would like to keep looking at the magic tool, and he tells her he would like to do that. They keep walking, and something catches Rentt's eyes. He asks Laura about them, and she tells him they are materials gotten from monsters, which can be used to make medicine or weapons. Rentt gets close to the materials, and he spots a vial of human juice, which makes him thirsty. Laura wonders if he's interested in it, and she tells him it's a vial of vampire body juice. She tells him consumption of the content would turn the person into a vampire, and Rentt wonders if it's true, but she tells him it's just rumors. Rentt wonders if no one turned into a vampire after drinking it, and Laura tells him nobody would confess to being a vampire if they get turned. She tells him with the rumors people would want it to get a chance at immortality, and Rentt makes his choice on the magic tool he wants. Rentt returns home, and Lorraine can see that took the model warship as his reward, just like every man in their right senses would because of how cool it is. Rentt starts operating it, and Lorraine tells him she had no idea the Western airships were modeled after the magic tool. She realizes he can also transfer his consciousness through it. Lorraine wonders why the Laddle family are so free with gifts, and he tells her it's because there aren't many adventurers who can journey to the Tarask swamp regularly. Isaac gave Rentt an extra gift before he left as compensation for accepting the request, and he tells Rentt he'll always be paid each time he completes the request task. Isaac was glad he could now devote himself fully to caring for Laura. Rentt asks Lorraine if she wants to try the magic tool, but she tells him it's time to face reality and stop playing with tools. Meanwhile, Isaac crushes the dragon blossoms to make medicine, and he presents it to Laura. He wonders if she liked Rentt, and she tells him Rentt was a rare sort of guest, but Isaac tells her to get some rest. Lorraine wonders if the vampire body juice is authentic, and he tells her that it's authentic because he felt that something will change within him if he drank it. She reminds him that people who consumed vampire body juice met a bitter end. Lorraine notices he's hesitant, and he tells her he's scared, but he knows he needs it to evolve. He tells her his body wants, but she tells him it may be too dangerous for him despite having an undead body. Lorraine tells him to avoid drinking it if he can, because she won't mind him remaining as an undead as long as he can spend his life as an adventurer. But Lorraine realizes he'll do anything possible to become a Mythril rank adventurer. Lorraine tells Rentt to refrain from taking in the vampire juice if he can do without it, because she doesn't mind if he remains an undead. But she realizes he'll do anything to achieve the highest adventurer rank. She knew he would not hesitate to do whatever he must to achieve his dreams, and he tells her he has been dreaming about becoming the highest ranked adventurer since he was a kid. Lorraine suddenly recalls Sheila asking her about something previously, and Rentt wonders what Sheila asked her. She tells Rentt not to worry about it because it's not important, but he tells her she's just making him more curious. He tries to press her to tell him, and she finally gives in, but she tells him he doesn't have to answer the question if he doesn't want to. Rentt is surprised because he thought Lorraine already knew all about him, but Lorraine tells him she's yet to uncover a lot of mysteries about him. She turns to him and in all seriousness asks him what he wants to become a Mythril rank adventurer, which surprises him. Rentt wonders if he hasn't told her in the past, and she tells him she somewhat knows the answer to the question since they've been together for a long time. She decides to forget about the question, and she tells him to drink the vampire juice already, so he can evolve because she doesn't care anymore. Rentt tells her she's being mean, but she reminds him of when he told her that adventurers don't ask about the past of other adventurers. Though Lorraine is convinced that Rentt doesn't have a shady past, she decided to hold back a bit after she told him that. Rentt tells her there's nothing interesting about his ambition, but he's never had the time to tell her about it. He sits on the couch, and he solemnly tells her his ambition is for revenge. He tells her it's not all about revenge because he once wanted to become an adventurer who could prevent tragedies. He tells her he comes from Hathara, which is a village located deep in the mountains on the frontier. His father was tasked with doing the trades and the errands of the village. They first took Rentt out of the village on a carriage when he was only 5. Rentt was intrigued by the outside world, and he loved looking at animals moving across the fields as they passed by with their carriage. Jinlin wondered what kind of place the town they were going to will be because there were a lot of things they were yet to see. She expressed her optimism to see the village, but Rentt told her he was scared because the town would hold a lot of people and they could be cowards. Jinlin was disappointed he was such a coward, and she told him he won't become an adventurer if he remains in a state of cowardice. She told him she wanted to see everything the world had to offer when she became older. She was eager to see a waterfall, a city surrounded by water, or a castle that can disappear just like a mirage. She told him the earth was home of many interesting places, but Rentt told her the places she mentioned sounded dangerous. She promised to become strong and protect Rentt. He tells Lorraine he was very reserved when he was younger, and she's surprised because she thought he was training every day with a wooden sword when he was younger. He tells her it was Jinlin who was doing that. Jinlin took him all over the town, and they always got scolded by the different grandmas who lived in the town. Rentt confesses that those were fun times in retrospect, which surprises Lorraine. He tells her they were attacked by a monster on their way back from their journey outside the village. The monster destroyed their carriage and their grandma was hurt. She told them to run to safety so they don't get hurt, but Jinlin just keeps shouting her name. Rentt looked over at his unmoving parents as they lay in the ground, and this brought tears to his eyes. The monster came out of the forest in front of Rentt, but he was too terrified to do anything. Jinlin quickly grabbed him, and they ran away from the scene. The monster moved in a different direction, and though Rentt knew it was cold to leave everyone else behind, he was sure it was just both of them left alive. They kept running till they were exhausted, and Jinlin was convinced they were safe. They suddenly heard some footsteps, and the monster appeared on a ledge above them. The huge wolf monster leapt off the ledge, and Rentt could tell the monster was cruelly toying with them. The wolf turned towards them and lunged at Rentt, but Jinlin pushed him away just in time to save him. Rentt watched as the wolf took down Jinlin, and he wondered why she took a hit for him. She reminded him that she said she would always protect him, and she told him to become stronger. The monster was about to take Rentt down also, but an adventurer appears out of nowhere to protect him. Rentt watched with awe as the adventurer told him to stay back while he took down the monster. The adventurer rushed at the monster, and a fierce battle commenced between the two. The adventurer tried to take the monster down with one clean swipe of his sword, but the monster evaded his strike. He decided to change tactics and stab at the monster, but the monster caught his sword with its teeth and threw him off balance. The adventurer then jumps into the air and lands a powerful attack in the ground, but the monster jumps to dodge it. The adventurer was surprised the monster was still looking for a fight, even though it was hurt. The monster then suddenly turned back and ran away. The adventurer walked up to Rentt wondering if he was okay, but Rentt wondered why the adventurer didn't come sooner. The adventurer admitted his fault, and he apologized to Rentt, but Rentt was too overcome with grief to accept his apology. Rentt tells Lorraine the adventurer helped him bring back the bodies of his family to the village. After the incident, Rentt began training under a tree, and the adventurer paid him a visit one day. He took the opportunity to ask the adventurer how he could become one, which surprises the adventurer. The adventurer wondered why he wanted to know, and he told the adventurer he wanted to carry on the dream of his friend. The adventurer asked him his age, and Rentt told the adventurer he was 5 years old. The adventurer told him he could only register at the Adventurers Guild when he turns 15, and he urged Rentt to train hard in the village before then. He told Rentt to learn now to fight monsters and study. He also told him to study herbs and plants while also learning some survival skills. He told Rentt to convince the village herbalist and warrior to take him as their apprentice. Rentt was surprised that the adventurers didn't just wish him good luck and leave him to his fate. Rentt wondered if he would become an adventurer if he did all the adventurer asked him to do, and the adventurer told him it's not a guarantee, but it's a starting point. He told him the rest would depend on his effort. The adventurer told him his name was Wilfried Rucker, a Mythril rank adventurer, and told Rentt to remember that. The adventurer told him to look for him once he became an adventurer, and though the adventurer wasn't sure where he would be in 10 years, he was sure he'd still be an adventurer if he was alive. He told Rentt not to lose his life until he achieved his dream. Lorraine is surprised Rentt went through all that as a kid, but Rentt tells her it's a common story in frontier villages. Lorraine isn't sure if Rentt is lucky because being saved by a Mythril rank adventurer is very rare. Lorraine realizes his kindness was influenced by the adventurer. Rentt tells Lorraine the adventurer was king because he realized Rentt had a goal and the will to achieve that goal. Lorraine now understands why the adventurer gave him intrinsic details about becoming an adventurer. Rentt promises to defeat the monster who took the lives of his family and friends and to become a Mythril rank adventurer just like Wilfried. Lorraine realizes it has been 20 years since his encounter with the adventurer and Rentt is disappointed that he's still stuck in the bronze rank. Though Rentt was scared of losing his life, he was even more scared of giving up. Lorraine realizes his hesitation was an act, but she promises to give him a befitting burial if he loses his life. He tells her to incinerate him if he starts acting weird, but Lorraine prays she doesn't have to resort to that. Rentt uncaps the bottle and his mask automatically changes to reveal his mouth. He empties the bottle into his mouth and Lorraine stands waiting anxiously. He tells her he's alright for the meantime and she's relieved. She thinks the vampire juice may be fake, but suddenly Rentt begins to have a serious mental attack. He screams while clawing at his head and then throws up a purple liquid. Lorraine begs him to land on, but he suddenly screams with chilling agony. Mentally, Rentt couldn't understand why his body felt like it was being recreated from scratch, and he hoped he wouldn't become a monster. He suddenly hears Lorraine's voice calling out to him, and she reminds him of his goal. She begs him to come back alive, and Rentt struggles to free himself from his mental bondage. Clope is making a sword on his anvil, but he realizes it won't be worth much without some orichalcum. His wife tells him he doesn't have to work so early in the morning, but she figures out the sword he's working on is for Rentt. She's confused because Clope recently gave Rentt a new sword, but she figures out that Rentt has gotten a lot stronger. She encourages her husband to make a befitting sword for Rentt. The children at the orphanage play a game outside while Elise is doing some cleaning. She practices her sword movement with her mop and Lillian teases her about being a strong knight. Elise tells her she needs to be in bed resting, but Lillian tells her she's feeling better. She decides to have breakfast with the children and Elise is sure everyone will be overjoyed to have her at the table. Lillian thanks Elise for her efforts to make her healthy, but Elise tells her everyone contributed to make sure she became well. Rise, Laura, and Rena are the first adventurers to enter the guild early in the morning and Sheila welcomes them. Rise looks through the open job requests and he thinks about taking one on the second floor of the labyrinth, but Rena tells him it would be too difficult for them. They decide to go for another request, but Sheila advises them to be careful while they're in the labyrinth. She tells them to turn back if they feel anything is amiss, and they promise to heed her warnings. Rentt gains consciousness in a mental plane, lying in a huge sea with the blue sky above him. He feels so sleepy and he realizes it has been so long since he felt the need to sleep. Since he became an undead, his body and his heart always felt empty, but he felt more humane with each evolution he underwent. He began to lose all the fear and despair that engulfed him after he became an undead. He figures out that he was only able to endure it because he was immortal. He finally gains physical consciousness and he wakes up to see Lorraine reading by his side. He wonders what she's reading, but she's surprised he's awake. She tells him she was reading about the classification of vampires. She tells him it's rare to see powerful vampires, which makes it harder to classify them. Rentt wonders why she's reading the book, but he figures it out after she congratulates him on his successful evolution. Rentt looks at his skin and he wonders what he has become. Lorraine tells him she can run tests to confirm, and she tells him to take off his clothes. Rentt takes them off and Lorraine studies his physical appearance. She notices wings on his back, which surprises Rentt, but they suddenly shrink and Lorraine realizes he can change their size if he focuses on them. Rentt wonders what he has become, but Lorraine tells him she's not sure. She tells him he's a weaker vampire, but she has never seen one with wings, so she decides to look it up later. She tells him to show her his face and open his mouth. She notices small fangs, and she tells him he's like a vampire. She tells him to reveal the upper part of his face and open his eyes. Rentt does this, and Lorraine notices his eyes are red. She tells him vampires are known to have red eyes, but humans do too, so he won't stand out so much. She's glad to see his face again, and she tells him she has been yearning to say something to his face, which makes Rentt wonder what she has to say. She touches his face and welcomes back Rentt Faina emotionally. Rentt tells her he's glad to be back to a semblance of his old self.